Hello, world. It's me, your old pal, Dan Shaheen. Got a humdinger of a show today. We're going to talk to Mark Evanier. We're going to talk about, there's so many things to talk about. I have to be very careful because I got to be mindful of the guy's time. But I have so many questions. What is Mark Evanier? He's a writer. If you asked him, that's what he would tell you, right? What does he write? He writes words, right? For what? Whatever you need words for. You need magazine articles, you need books, you need comic books, you need TV shows. How about a blog? How about 20 years of when he's not getting paid to write, in his spare time, he's just writing, right? So this is what I like about this guy is his blog is not one that's calculated to draw controversy or draw clicks. It's one that's all about talking about the things he likes talking about, or writing about, I should say. And that's so many things. So we're going to bring him in a minute and talk about it. First of all, a little bit of show business. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel. There's a little button down there. It says subscribe. There's even a little bell-shaped thing. You click on that, you get notifications, and you find out about all the great videos and all the cool people that we're interviewing. Man, I've interviewed a lot of them, and I got a lot coming up. I've got one scheduled for next week, but I'm not going to drop it yet because we had some scheduling problems in the past, and I want to just make sure it's all locked in before I announce it. Got people watching already and got comments out there. Hey, guys, Gru rules. Yeah, we're going to talk about Gru. Coffee breath, long-time watchers watching. Okay, guys, as you know, we're going to have a Q&A section at the end. Feel free to chatter or super chat or do whatever you want during the show. Your comments may or may not make it on. Wait for the Q&A. They will make it on, okay? Awesome. So one more piece of business. If you want to see your comics here on the $1 Million Comics Cam, where do you send them? Well, to the $1 Million mailbox. P.O. Box 1163 in beautiful Arcata, California, 95518. Send them here. We'll spread them out. We'll take a look. We're going to look at some books today on the $1 Million Comics Cam from our guest. So why not bring him in right now? Welcome to the show for the first time, Mark Evanier. Hi, Mark.
Hello.
Great to have you. Thanks for making time to do this. I appreciate it.
Yes, and I remodeled my office here so that my background blends seamlessly with your background.
Almost perfectly, but
yeah.
You know what? I think we need to change a venue, to tell you the truth, Mark, because I know you're a fan of all things of this, many things of the '60s. So I'm going to change venues real quick. Hang on just a sec.
Okay.
The Bat Pulse.
Okay. Great. Well, let's bring it to the Bat Cave. You were a huge fan of Batman 1966, weren't you?
Yes and no. I was a huge fan of the actors in the show. I loved watching the actors, the people in it, Adam West and Victor Buono and Julie Newmar. Julie Newmar waited until she was like 80 years old to fall in love with me. We became very good friends there. And
I'll take that.
I would settle for that. Yes. And I did not. There was an undercurrent in the show that I did not like, and so I like it in spite of the fact that I am very much aware that the people behind that show thought that Batman was a stupid idea and that you had to be mentally deficient to read his comic books. There was a contempt for the audience there that made me uncomfortable. I felt it when I was watching the show, and then I met a few of the people who worked on the show years later, and they couldn't believe that anyone really cared about Batman because they sure didn't. They
Right.
they cared about it as a great job that they were proud of doing such a great rip job of such a stupid idea in their from their viewpoint. So I like the people. I loved. I worked on a TV show one time where Burgess Meredith was taping a show next door to us, and I would go over and just sit with Mr. Meredith when they didn't need him on the set and talk with him, and you could talk with him about anything except Batman. He
Ah,
would talk about his wonderful career. There's an actor with so much history. Um, he was proud of Batman, but he was very sick of the fact that so many people thought that's all he'd ever done.
right.
And
And I would guess that the three top things that come to mind for Burgess Meredith are going to be the Penguin. It's going to be Mick from Rocky, and it's going to maybe be the Twilight Zone episode.
yeah, well, this is a guy who was a Broadway star, a director who did plenty of great plays and did wonderful movie. He had a very long career, and it's very strange part of show business that the thing you often get best known for and or make the most money from is not the thing you're proudest of.
Right. I was going to say
And
Clash of the Titans too. He probably got a
well,
lot of people
yeah, I mean,
talking about.
he wasn't, we would slip into talking about Batman every once in a while, but he would bring it up, not me. And um, and he would refer to the bird. Yeah, when I was playing the bird, and the show that he was doing was a show called Those Amazing Animals, which he hosted on ABC for a while. And they actually had a penguin, a live penguin, on stage with him all the time as a mascot. And he had this great affection for the little penguin, and was pleased. I think at that moment, I think the thing he liked best about Batman was that he got to play with a little penguin on the set.
Okay.
So
Seems like a lot of actors from that era, like they had this legacy that was tied to them that they hated kind of for a long time, but they sort of grew to realize how important it was.
well, you find in this world that people know you forever from the first thing they knew you from. So, for example, when Paul Winchell died, the great ventriloquist Paul Winchell, most of the headlines said "Voice of Tigger dies," and that was like 2% of everything he'd ever done in
Right.
his life. But to some people, that was the most important, and it was not, "Hey, this great TV star and ventriloquist and man who had many patents and invented a prototype for an artificial heart was also the voice of Tigger." It was the other way around. It was like, "Hey, do you know the voice of Tigger also invented an artificial heart and used to be a
Right.
ventriloquist?" And for someone like Burgess Meredith, did you know that the guy who played the Penguin was also on Broadway with the Mice and Men? I mean, it was things like that. Um,
Sure.
and you see this at comic conventions. I have this, my friend, the late Chuck McCann, used to come down to Comic Con and walk around, and there are people who knew Chuck from his kids shows in New York in the 60s, and that was who Chuck McCann was to them, and everything else was like an add-on. And there were people who knew him best for his TV commercials, and there are people who knew him best for his cartoon voicing and for some of the movies and TV shows he'd been in lately. Um, we were walking through the convention, I think the last time he was down there, and people kept pointing, a couple of people kept saying, "Oh, there's Judge Fudd from Boston Legal."
Huh.
And they didn't know he'd done anything else, or if they did, it was a parenthetical, thing like saying, there are people who are watching you now, and who, if in the future you run for president, become president of the United States, it's the guy who did that webcast,
Right.
is also the president. So
Well, I don't think we're going to get there, but I will say Chuck McCann, man, what an underrated talent. One of those super talents of where I remember him last from. Oh my gosh. Oh yeah. The movie, The Aristocrats.
oh yeah, yes, yeah.
And he refused to tell the joke, but he told a clean version of just couple clean versions of the joke that were just fall down hilarious. Really,
Chuck,
really
Chuck
talented.
was one of the greatest storytellers I've ever met, and I've met a lot of great storytellers. And for I'm part of a group called Yarmy's Army, which is a kind of a support group for older comedians that they that when I was almost the mascot when I got into it. And I would go to these meetings years ago, and you go around the table, and there's a joke. A good old friend of mine, Gary Belkin, a comedy writer, wrote a joke one time which has been plagiarized so much that Neil Simon stole it, admittedly stole it, and put it in the movie
Okay.
Play Sweet Charity. He said, I went to this party, and you wouldn't believe the people who were there. I was the only one there I'd never heard of. And I
Right.
would go to these meetings, and around the table, I'd be sitting between Howard Morris and Don Knotts. For some reason, I was Howie's guest usually, so I would sit there. And around the table is Pat Harrington, Louis Nye, Harvey Korman, Tim Conway, Pat McCormick, Bob Ridgely, Gary Owens, Ron Carey, Shecky Green sometimes, Bill Dana sometimes, Tom Poston, just all these people, mostly guys who were like second bananas and character comedians. Shelley Berman would be at the
Who are
table.
some of the funniest people in the
Yes,
business, right?
yeah. So what would happen would be that someone would tell a story about Milton Berle, for example, and everybody around the table had a Milton Berle story because everybody had worked with Milton Berle,
Right.
and they would all go around the table and they tell their Milton Berle story, and he'd tell his Milton Berle story, and then Chuck would just lay back, and then they'd get to Chuck, and he would tell the last Milton Berle story because nobody could follow whatever
Right.
Chuck's story was. And then somebody else would tell a story about having a bad agent, and everybody would go around the table because everybody in show business has a bad agent story. And then Chuck would tell the definitive bad agent story, and that would end the topic, and a new topic would come up because he'd always top everybody.
Okay.
And
So
and
you
that
ran.
and in that room, that was quite an achievement.
I'll bet. I mean, you ran in some major league circles, Mark. I mean, you got involved with, and I want to talk. I want to move a little bit into your comics writing career if we can, and I want to talk.
Whatever you want.
Okay. I mean, I know you wrote comics at an early age. You did Gold Key. You did all kinds of stuff, which is fascinating. But then ultimately, you ended up getting involved through a mail order operation, designing posters and
Oh
or
yeah.
something for the great Jack Kirby, right?
Well, I got involved. I got involved with Jack Kirby, and I also simultaneously got involved with a company called Marvel Mania International,
Yes.
which joined the ranks of the grand tradition of comic books of cheating Jack Kirby. And they cheated me, and they cheated people. Um, but literally, what happened was that in July of 1969, a couple of weeks after I got out of high school, um, a bunch of us, we had a comic book club in LA at the time, and we got invited to go down to Irvine, California, where Jack Kirby was living, and to meet Jack Kirby. And of course, I wanted to meet one of my favorite comic book artists and creators. And being in Los Angeles, I'd had very little contact with people who actually made comic books. If I'd been living in New York, going to the New York conventions, I could have met all of them. But at that point, the only people I'd met who did comics, I met an artist named Ken Landau who did horror comics and stuff in the 50s. And then I met, in this sequence, um, Bob Kane, Jerry Siegel, and Jack Kirby. So I tell people, I use the line I was using was, I met the co-creator of Superman, the co-creator of Batman, and the co-creator of everything else.
Yeah.
Uh, and uh, and Jack was the one I really wanted to meet of those. So the day we went down to meet him, this is my life abounds in great coincidences. I was taking the bus. I didn't drive. I took the bus down to a newsstand where I picked up the new comics. It was a Tuesday, and that's the day the new comics came out in LA. And I bought the new comics, and in the Marvels that had come out that day, which were the first of that month's Marvels, there was an ad for this place called Marvel Mania International. And I thought, wow, it's got a P.O. box in Culver City, California. And I was at that moment 3 miles from Culver City.
Oh.
I never heard of, Marvel has an office of some sort here in LA. I should find out about this. So I went to a payphone and I called information, and they gave me a phone number for Marvel Mania International. I called it, and this man answered, and I told him I was the president of the local comic book club. And he said, "Oh, we want to meet the local fans. We're starting up here with this big club. Why don't you come down to our office right now if you can?" And I said, "I can't. I've got to go. I'm on my way to meet Jack Kirby." And there was a little pause. I wasn't sure the guy knew who Jack Kirby was. And then he said, "Oh, give Jack my best. Come by tomorrow, and here's our address." And he told me the address, and I was like 3 blocks from their office, 4 blocks from their office. Just of all the places in Los Angeles, they were right near me. So we went down. I met with my friends. Our club treasurer's mother drove us down to Irvine because none of us drove.
How old
And
were you at this time?
this is 1969. I was born in 1952, so 17.
Okay.
I was just out of high school, and I was just starting my career as a professional writer. I had just made my first sale to a magazine about a week earlier. So we met Jack Kirby that day. It was a wonderful day, a day that I did not realize at the time how life changing it would be. And Jack and I got along, and he was impressed with how much I knew about comic books. I mentioned about this Marvel Mania place, and he said, "Oh God, they need someone like you there. Uh, they don't know the comic books. These guys do not know the names of the characters. They don't know who draws them. They don't know
And
anything
Mark,
about it."
sorry to interrupt, but how
Yeah.
awesome is that? After a time when you just said nobody respected comic books and Batman, and here's this
Well,
adult hero like
the Batman,
appreciating your knowledge.
well, the Batman TV show people didn't respect comic books. I'm not one of those people who thinks everybody hates comic books or looks down on them. I have not had some of the experiences some of my friends say they've had of being
Oh,
belittled for reading comic books. That just has not been part of my life. Um, no, people look down on you if you're doing a kind of writing that pays poorly. And I knew people who looked down on comic books on the grounds that the people who do them weren't paid well.
okay.
That's different. But they're not saying, you should be ashamed for writing comic books. They're just
But I
saying
mean,
you
not
should
the
be
writing, but just the reading. The fact that he appreciated your knowledge of the comics. I gotta think that meant something to you.
Well, yeah, it did because I was proud. Well, Jack was the kind of, you never met Jack, did you? I take it you didn't meet Jack. Jack
Maybe
was one of
maybe
the,
you saw him once.
yeah, Jack was one of the nicest human beings I've ever met. And above and beyond what I learned from him about comic books and writing and creativity, I learned a lot about dealing with people, treating people well. He was so nice. In fact, in many cases, I think he was too nice. I think he trusted a lot of people he shouldn't have. But, it's nice when you have a role model in your life who you can look at and go, it's possible to get to the top without being a horrible person, without
Yes.
without having that. He was there was no treachery in Jack. There was no dishonesty in Jack. There was no desire to knife someone else in the back ever. He was always honest, at least insofar as his understanding of a situation was concerned. He was wrong at times, but he was never dishonest. I never caught Jack lying.
Gotcha.
I caught him being
Well,
wrong about things, getting confused, but not never lying, never slanting something,
I see.
spinning the truth, and uh, and that kind of and previously I had met Bob Kane, who was the opposite of that. Bob Kane started telling me how rotten everybody else in comics was, and you had to kind of screw them before they screwed you, and I thought, and he made the business sound very full of cutthroat, treachery people. And Jack was the opposite of that. He was the opposite of Bob Kane in about 80 different ways.
I mean, Mark, you know Jack Kirby so well. You should have wrote a book about him or something. I
I
think.
think I think I've written three already.
Okay. Well, why
Yeah,
don't
but
we take a look at one right now? I want
all
to take
right.
us into what we
Well,
call. I don't know
let
if
me
you've seen it.
but Dan, let me
Yeah.
just finish the story. One thing. Let me
Sure,
not
please.
leave a piece of the thing. So Jack told me, the guy at Marvel Mania needs someone, and the next day when I went to meet the fellows at Marvel Mania, the head of the company said Jack Kirby called and told us we ought to hire you. So they hired me. So I worked for them for a little less than a year. Um, a very tumultuous uh, year when you increasingly discovering the dishonesty of the company
Of
and
Marvel Mart.
of Marvel Mania, not of Marvel
Marvel Mania.
Comics. It was a
Yeah.
separate company that had got the
Yeah.
mail
Yeah.
order rights, and the guy was drastically underfunded and drastically overestimated his audience,
Oh,
and could not make any money. When you think back with what the mail order rights to all the Marvel characters would yield today, or even
right.
10 years later, boy, did he blow a multi-million-dollar opportunity. So anyway, so I got involved with Jack Kirby a little bit there, and
I
because I
want you
was
to keep
working.
talking about him though, but I want to
Okay,
look at. I'm gonna go
all
in
right,
and we'll look at your book
okay, all right.
while
Go
you're
ahead.
talking.
Okay, that's
We
the
got.
first edition of my a book I did for the Harry and Abrams publishers, and I'm very pleased with that book. One of the things that's amazing is people keep coming up to me and they say, "God, I love that book. It's so full of great artwork." And I went like, "Well, duh. I mean, how
Right.
difficult is it to assemble when you're doing It's like I did a book on Mad Magazine, um, and people were calling me saying, "You got a rave review in the New York Times." And I went, "Really? I got a rave review? Okay." And I finally get the review, and the review is, "Isn't Mad Magazine wonderful? Oh, this is Mad Magazine is great." It goes on and on, and at the end it says, "And Mark Evanier has this book about it." So I got a free ride, and um, you can't do a bad book of Jack Kirby artwork, or it's very difficult. And on top of
Yeah, you got a leg up on your visuals
well,
right out of the
and
gate.
also people love Jack so much that I had people offering me images and pictures, collecting all these things. Some of these things came out of my own collection, but some of these were originals that somebody else had, and everybody was willing to share them with me and to help out because they felt there should be, 50 books about Jack's work. And so it was kind of a joy to do. And I have to sometimes keep reminding myself and other people that the love of this book is the love of Jack, not of me. All I did was assemble stuff that people already loved, and it was just and I'm working on another book about Jack. I've written a couple of other. I've written a lot about Jack over the years because I feel very fortunate to have been in the position where I was witness to some things, and because Jack kept wanting me to write about him. And what I was saying about, the guy never lied to me. He never tried to spin things. Jack had this fierce belief in the truth. He believed that if someone told his story truthfully, he would come off great in it. There was no need to spin it. There was no need to embellish it. And uh, the book does say a few things about Jack mismanaging his career here and there. And this new book I'm
Yes.
working on about him, uh, you know, recognizes some bad career moves he made, because being able to write and draw brilliant comics doesn't guarantee that you know how to manage your career, especially in a business where he was, working for people who did not appreciate what he had to offer. He was working. A lot of the people at Marvel felt that a guy who could copy Kirby and draw roughly in the same style was just as good as
Right.
In other words, a bad Elvis impersonator is just as good as Elvis.
Right.
And
And
did
what were
not
they?
under.
But what were they missing in that?
Well,
Like
they
a
were
lot of people, I find miss sort of like they concentrate on the surface style of Kirby. Many times, I find as a young person didn't quite understand what was going on with Kirby till I started concentrating on the storytelling and the.
Well, that's what they miss. Like when I hear people talk about, I've run into thousands of people who want to talk about Jack Kirby with me, and that's fine. And there are people, sometimes I run to somebody who says, "I always thought John Buscema was a better artist." Well, that's fine. Nobody has, nobody is everybody's favorite. But if you think John Buscema and Jack Kirby were doing the same job, you're missing the point completely. Because
Okay.
the drawing of the actual pages was not job one for Jack. The creating the ideas and the concepts and the characters was what he was about. John Buscema did not sit down when he drew an issue of Fantastic Four and think, uh, what can I put in this issue? What new characters and concepts can I introduce that'll make this comic special? He drew the story he was assigned to draw, and he was given more of a plot outline by whoever the writer was that week than Jack ever got. And in his more candid moments, Stan Lee would tell me, "Gee, Jack made up all that stuff in these books." Stan did not say it in public enough for me, but he said it in private a lot. And so I came to the
My
more I
spider
was working
senses
for
are starting to
Jack,
tingle.
the more I came to appreciate that he was not just about putting lines on paper. He was about ideas and premises and concepts. There's a quote from his that, again, I was real glad I was around to hear this and to pass it on. He was looking at a fanzine, and there was a news item in it that said some new writer or artist was going to take over the Captain America comic book, and he said he's planning to do stories in the Kirby tradition. And Jack said, "The kid doesn't get it. The Kirby tradition is to create a new comic."
Ha!
And that absolutely clarified it for me. When Jack sat down to draw a comic book, it was all about changing the industry, elevating the industry, and by extension, if possible, elevating his own lifestyle, because nothing was more important to Jack than earning a good living and feeding his family properly and giving them all the perks of life. So
and really an innovator in the form and the business as well, in the sense of creating romance comics and other types of comics and really bringing those to market at a time when I bet there was resistance. And could you tell me a bit about the success of that kind of stuff?
Jack was teamed fortuitously with a very skilled man named Joe Simon. And people sometimes underestimate Joe Simon's contribution to the Simon and Kirby team, or dismiss it as, well, he was the business guy. Well, he was the business guy. He was a much better businessman, not only than Jack, but better than probably 98% of the people working in comics at the time.
Huh. Okay.
Joe had some experience in publishing and in working for newspapers before he got into comics, and Joe knew how to read a contract. And there are those who say that in the comic book industry in the 40s, the only two guys who knew how to read a contract were Joe Simon and Will Eisner. But Joe was a very skilled editor. Jack once said, and I believe this is true, that every time Simon Kirby worked for a new publisher, the publisher wanted to hire Joe as his in-house editor, because Joe understood comics, he understood design, he understood marketing a bit better than the average guy, and he also understood the skills of the people around him, including Jack. One of the keys to being a good editor is casting, to put the right guy in the right place. I have a belief that when people, look at a comic and go, "Oh God, look at this terrible artwork in it," at least half the time they're faulting the casting of the wrong artist is on the wrong book with the wrong inker. It's not that the artist is untalented, even though that's the way it comes down. They just say, and they act like the artist forced his way onto the book. The artist drew the book he was told to draw. And these guys were all living from job to job. None of them could really afford to turn down work. So if your company wanted you to draw a book you had no aptitude for, no taste for, no interest in, and they wanted to put an inker you hated on it, you just suffered in silence. An awful lot of the guys who drew comics in the 40s, 50s, and 60s hated the way their work looked when it came out on the newsstand. They hated the inker on it. They hated the coloring on it. But that was the job. You were just part of an assembly line.
Tell me a little bit about this lady.
Roz Kirby was one of the most amazing women I ever met. She was Jack's wife until the day he died. They met during just before Jack went off to World War II which I believe he single-handedly won, if I'm not mistaken. And she took care
He
of.
tells some good stories. He's told some stories for
Well,
sure.
there's a comic book artist I knew real well named Doug Wildey. You probably have heard of Doug Wildey.
Uh-huh.
And if we had a lot of local meetings with cartoonists, we formed a group called CAPS, where all the comic book artists would meet once a month and eat donuts and talk about the business. And if Doug walked into a room and Jack Kirby was there, he would start screaming, "No World War II stories! No World War II stories!" And Jack would kind of go, "Speaking of World War II, there was this one time I was in a foxhole, and no, Jack."
He would tell some gruesome ones. There's some
Jack had
gruesome
some
stories I've heard him say.
Yeah, I regret the fact that Jack never got a chance to do completely autobiographical World War II comics. Um, there's a wonderful comic book writer artist named Sam Glanzman who did a
Uh-huh.
series for DC Comics called the USS Stevens, which are among the greatest war comics ever done. And they're just autobiographical stuff, not necessarily all about killing Nazis. Some of it's about being on guard duty, and some of it's about being on a ship, and some of it's about swabbing the deck, which is a lot of what military life was for these guys. And they're honest, autobiographical, and real stories. And I, in hindsight, wish that somehow I had tried to leverage Jack into doing a series like that, and putting down his own his own wartime experiences seeped into the Sergeant Fury comic when he was doing it, and it seeped into a book called The Losers he did for a while. But in those cases, he had to fictionalize because the lead character was not, private, first class Jack Kirby. I wish he had done an honest rendition of what he remembered from World War II. We have now reached the stage where there's nobody alive who can do that.
Right.
He could have done that in his latter years, and somehow, the publishers who came to him all wanted the new Silver Surfer. They didn't want war comics. But as you page through the book, you see the evolution of all these new innovations, and you could stop at almost any page and say, if this was all the guy had done, we would still be hailing him. And you aren't even anywhere near Marvel yet as you go through these.
And what's amazing is how much his style changed. I mean, he's fully realized innovative creator right now. But this is his style goes on and changes and evolves.
And this is also a Joe Simon collaboration. Joe's on these pages too, in different ways. I think he inked some of this stuff.
Beautiful inking.
And he I mean, Joe was a first class guy. And when people used to ask Jack who did what in the Simon Kirby shop, he said, "We both did everything." And that's true. Now, in truth, Jack probably penciled a lot more than Joe. Joe probably inked a lot more than Jack. Joe did a lot of the dealing with the other artists who worked for the shop and being editor of their, it wasn't an exact twin, but they were both capable of doing everything. Joe Simon could put out a comic book all by himself. He could write it, draw it, pencil it, letter it, ink it. He could probably even have colored it and run the press. And The Fly was a case where Simon was the dominant particular, because that was after the Simon Kirby team kind of split up. Joe got the deal to do the Fly comic and another one called The Double Life of Private Strong for the Archie people, and Joe brought Jack in to work on that.
I've heard a lot of people talk about that Double Life of Private Strong comic as a very important comic to them. Barry Windsor Smith, I think, cited it as super influential to him.
Yeah, and it only ran 2 issues. The DC Comics
I've never seen it.
It's findable. It's expensive, but not prohibitive. It was a very good. They took the Shield, which was a patriotic character that had predated Captain America, and they kind of remade it into something a little more modern for in this case, late 50s. And it's a good comic. It's not maybe the best thing they ever did. Neither is The Fly, in my opinion. But, nothing Joe and or Jack individually or collectively did was not worthy of reading. These are 2 guys who just understood comics, and it was very fortuitous that they teamed up. because I don't think Jack would have been able to sell his work as well as Joe was. I don't think Joe would be able to produce as many
Okay.
pages without Jack.
Well, speaking of fortuitous team ups, though, right?
Yes.
This seems like we got to get into this a little bit. I mean,
Sure.
this has been discussed ad nauseum, but like in my opinion, there's a little bit to be said. Like I feel like it used to be Stan Lee got all the credit, then now it's become like Stan Lee gets no credit. I want to know what you think about the
Okay.
controversy here.
I will actually tell you, I just really wrote an essay. They're putting out later this year. The Harriet Abrams Company is putting out a book of a Fantastic #1 reprinted from an actual copy of the printed issue. They got a very good copy. They photographed the pages. Chip Kidd designed
One of those.
a new way to lay them out. And it's one of these things where we kind of blow up the panels and look at them closer. There was a book done some years ago at Marvel, which had a few problems in this format. This is kind of an upgrade of that book with new essays, and I wrote a new article for it. The bottom line answer here, and
Yes.
and this is the only possible answer to the question, is that the Fantastic Four was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby.
Yes.
Nobody who was around Marvel at the time would ever argue that point. And I'm a guy who interviewed Steve Ditko and Don Heck and Larry Lieber and Saul Brodsky and Stan Goldberg and Flo Steinberg and everybody else who worked for Marvel in those days. Dick Ayers. I talked to everybody I could talk to, and even some people nobody talks to, like Ditko. And there was a unanimity of opinion that these guys created the comic together. Now, no one would say it was a 50-50 collaboration, but most collaborations are not. I've had writing partners, and I couldn't tell you after the fact if I did, 90% of it or 30% of it sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And of the two, I think that Jack Kirby was the more creative and the more innovative by far. And I think that Stan Lee was the editor of the company, and that he gets credit for these books getting to press. He gets credit for the promotion of them. He gets credit for a lot of contributions. If you like the dialogue in them, as some people love the dialogue in them, he gets credit. He gets credit for that. The storylines, the concepts, and the characters, I think, are more Jack than Stan. And I based that in part on just talking to Stan informally. Stan Lee over lunch with no tape recorder running was a little different guy than Stan Lee speaking to the press or for posterity. And Stan Lee, when he wasn't worried about the new owners of Marvel keeping him on, was a little different person than the guy Stan Lee was when he felt very secure in his job.
I will say this. I met Stan Lee one time, and I brought to him to sign the Silver Surfer graphic novel, original graphic novel he did with Jack Kirby. And all he could talk about was what a great job Jack did. He was made it a point to give a lot of credit, the lion's share of the credit, at least, in person with me to Kirby for sure.
Yeah. That drawing you're on, stand that Hulk drawing for a second.
Yeah.
Jack,
yeah.
That's a drawing Jack gave me. He said, I want to do a drawing for you, Mark. And I said, okay. He said, what do you want? I said, draw whatever you like. I have found that when artists say, what do you want me to draw for you? If you say, draw whatever you like, you get a much better drawing than if you tell them what to do. So
really?
So Jack drew the Hulk, and he's put Thor in the background. I don't know why Thor is in the background, but he put Thor in the background. I think in the middle of it, he was drawing and he thought, oh, wait a minute, I should have drawn Thor. Mark loves Thor. Okay, I'll put Thor in the background. Anyway, so when he gave it to me, I looked at it, and it was wonderful and terrific, and I vowed right there I would never have it inked. I had the pencils treated so they would not fade. But I did notice when he gave it to me that on the foot on our right, the Hulk has 5 toes, and on the foot on the left, the Hulk has 4 toes. And I mentioned this to Jack, and he went, oh, let me fix it. I go, no, please leave it the way it is.
Yeah.
Please leave it the way it is, because first of all, the comics are full of those type of things. You can find lots of those things in the comics. And secondly, I like the fact that this was absolutely raw, unfiltered Kirby. I didn't want it to be filtered by me having him make a change. And the thing that about Jack that's again some people I don't think get was he drew from the gut. He sat down and this stuff just poured out of him. He did very little underdrawing, sometimes none. He did not do roughs. About every 3 years or so, someone would come to me and they'd say, "Hey, let's do a book of Jack's rough sketches." And I'd say there aren't any. There actually, I have in this book a few pages down the line there. There's a rough sketch for a Thor cover for Tales of Asgard. It is the only surviving sketch Jack for a Marvel cover
Oh,
Jack
wow.
did, as far as I know, in the world. It's a couple more pages down there, and that page
Yeah.
is just an example of Jack giving maximum of, I mean, nobody else would have spent as long on that gun as Jack did. And
Well,
Joe
this to
Sinnott
me, this
did
picture
every bit of
just
it.
says a lot because we've had Doctor Doom on the big screen many times now, several times, with millions and millions of dollars behind it, costume design and writing and special effects and everything, and they've never even come close to capturing something like this page captures.
Yeah, it's a beautiful page. The hardest thing about doing this book was deciding what to leave out because we had hundreds of pages that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll go to the Tales of Asgard pages. A couple more over. It's
Okay.
about 4 or 5 more pages in. I'll show you.
Oh man. Oh. Such everything here. This is
Yeah.
the moment. I really feel like if there was only one Lee Kirby Marvel book, Fantastic Four is the one.
Well, yeah, and there's people who would say Thor. And
Here we
people would
go.
say, okay, so here we are. That sketch, which has Stan's notes in the margin, I found in Jack's files, and he gave it to me. It is to my. He did generally the sketches. He didn't do sketches like this. There were no sketches for 95% of those covers, but for some reason on this one he did this. Stan made some notes, and and people kept saying to me, "Oh, can we do a whole book of things like that?" I said, "No, this is the only one in all the years I've been studying Jack Kirby and seeing Kirby art. It is the only one I've ever found."
Oh my gosh.
Anyway, there's a poster that Jack did for Marvel Mania on the left, which he never got paid for, never got a cent for it. It's been made
really?
into T-shirts. It's been on toys. It's been marketed every place. Jack was never paid a nickel for it.
For this one.
For this one on the left, they had Herb Trimpe redraw it, and as you can see, Herb basically just traced it. I mean, literally.
Looks like he gave him a toe. Looks like he added the fifth toe, maybe.
Yeah, he got it right there. And Jack inked that drawing of that Hulk drawing, which is rare
okay.
for him. And I'll tell you.
Why was that?
What, the toes?
No,
Why he inked
that
it?
he's so rarely inked. I get because he wanted to go faster.
Well, here's the thing. I will tell you the end. There's a couple of things. One was inking bored Jack because the story was over. Jack was all about telling stories, and he told the story in pencil, and then the story was over. So to go back and ink it felt superfluous and repetitive. But also, Jack was about upward mobility. He wanted to do comics that would sell better, and therefore would, he thought, lead to enhanced income for him and his family and enhanced prestige, and give him more clout to do more projects that he wanted to. He believed that the inking didn't make a difference to the sales, or didn't make much of a difference. So if given the choice of writing and penciling 2 comics in pencil only, or writing, penciling, inking 1, he felt he was doubling his chances of having a hit book by doing the former. So, it's one of the few ways I influenced Jack, I think, and believe me, these are microscopic in the grand scheme of his life, is that I got him to be a little more conscientious about inking. When I met him, he didn't really care who inked him. He was fine with anybody. He said, any professional will do. And I convinced him that that wasn't quite the case. And I wasn't the only one telling him that. But he came to appreciate Mike Royer, who was his inker on most of the DC stuff, tremendously. There's a Royer inking there.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
maybe Vinny Coletta a little bit less.
Well, he fired Vinny Coletta. People act like I fired Vinny Coletta. No, Jack fired Vinny Coletta, and it was partly the work and partly a personal
Oh.
clash and a
Oh,
business
okay.
clash and such. Um, but anyway, like I said, I'll tell you a quick story about when we were doing this book. I had tons of stuff, obviously, and at one point I had a photo in this book of Jack with Sergio Aragonis, and Sergio, pre-pandemic, Sergio used to come to my office every week at least once, even though he was driving quite a distance sometimes to get here. And I showed him. He saw the book in progress, and he saw different things. And at one point, he saw a layout of this photo of Jack and him together. Was on a page, and as I made the final decision of what to drop out, that I removed that photo. So the book came out. I gave Sergio a copy, and I said, "I'm sorry, I had to drop that photo of you with Jack." And Sergio goes, "Oh, that's all right, fine." He goes home. He calls me up that evening, and he says, I see my photo is in the book." And I said, "No, I had to drop it out, Sergio." "No, no, there's a photo of me in the book." And I said, "And why can't I turn off my damn phone?"
That's
And this is a spam call. Ignore it.
okay.
Um, uh, I said, "It's not in there." He says, "No, no, I will bet you." And he offered some huge sum of money that I knew he didn't have, that his photo was in the book. And I went through the book and to make sure, did I put that photo in and not remember it? And I
Uh-huh.
couldn't. And I called him up and I said, "Sergio, there's no photo of you in this book." He said, "I will bet you there's a photo of me in the book." Would you turn, Dan? Would you
Yeah.
turn back to the beginning
Yeah.
of the book? Turn back to the beginning
Sure.
of the whole book, okay?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, go in like 3-4 pages.
Okay.
Go to the full page photo of Jack standing there. Okay, that
Yes.
photo there of Jack is
Ah.
okay. And the wall on behind him, there's a picture of
Yes.
Sergio. Sergio's in the
Yes.
margins. If you look real closely at the
Wait a
background,
minute. Let me
there's
hang on. I can do this.
okay. Above Jack's head, up to the left, that photo you see up
Yes.
right to the upper left is a
Uh-huh.
photo from a convention of Jack, and Don Rico and Mike Royer are also in the photo. And there's
Awesome.
Sergio. Sergio is in the photo. He snuck in. He photobombed.
I
Uh,
love it.
this is a photo that was taken by a gentleman named Greg Preston, who did a wonderful book of a couple of volumes of books where he went around the country and shot artists in their own home studios. And he gave us permission to use this photo of Jack working on the drawing that is on the facing page of this book. And
Uh-huh.
but there's anyway. If you look carefully, there's Sergio in the background. He got in after all.
Okay, Mark, this is a great tee up here because let's we went through the Kirby book. Anybody wants to know more Kirby stuff, read this, read Mark's forthcoming book, right? There's a multi-volume set coming soon or
Well,
what? Or someday?
it's a very thick book, but I'm not promising when it'll be out because, believe it or not, I'm still finding new stuff to put into it.
Okay. You and George R.R. Martin, we're just going to harass you till the end of time.
Okay, that's fine. As long as we get the same money, I'm fine with that.
So wait a minute. So let's talk then about your work with another genius, another guy who draws like nobody else, who's instantaneously recognizable, who's probably I don't know, he's the greatest living cartoonist treasure I think we've got.
Well, I wouldn't. That's like a weapon. I wouldn't point at a friend, but yeah, he's rather amazing. One of the many things that fascinates me in this business is that comic book artists and artists in general, and it applies to writers as well, are big fans of each other, and they're all aware of what each other can do. Um, I was just interviewed for a documentary that's being done on my old friend Dave Stevens, who did The Rocketeer. And Dave did a cover once for a comic I was doing called Crossfire. And he was an enormous fan of the artist who drew the insides, a man named Dan Spiegel, who
Dan
was,
Spiegel.
I think, one of the great genius. I would put Dan in the top 10 comic book artists of all time. And I was
Yeah.
very pleased to work with him so much. So they're at a San Diego convention, and this issue has just been done. And Dan says to Dave, "That's an amazing cover you did. I couldn't have drawn that if I spent a week on it." And Dave said, "Thanks, but I spent 2 weeks on it." Uh, and then he said, "And the insides of that book were amazing. I couldn't have drawn that if I spent a year on it." And Dan had to say, "I spent a week on it."
Uh,
There are two guys who admired each other tremendously and were very much aware that each one could do something the other guy couldn't do,
yeah.
and envied themselves. You see this all the time. One day I was at a San Diego con. I was walking. I walked up to. I came back from a lunch meeting, and I walked up to this group of about a dozen of the top superhero artists of the day. They were just standing there talking informally and in the middle of the room. And for no visible reason, I said hello, and I said, "Hey, I just had lunch with the best artist in the room." And they all looked at me like, "Oh yeah, who's that?" And I said, "Mort Drucker." And there was this moment they all went,
Ooh.
"Yeah, you're right. Yeah, yeah." Because none of them could do what Mort Drucker could do. These guys could draw phenomenal Batman and Spider-Man and X-Men and
Mm-hmm.
giant superhero things, but not one of them felt he was anywhere near the equal of Mort Drucker when it came to drawing celebrity caricatures. And
And I'll bet you Mort Drucker could draw just about anything he wanted to in any style, like in
well,
other styles as well.
yeah, well, Mort did, originally work in, he drew DC War comics. He drew
Yeah.
romance comics for DC. He inked a man named Owen Fitzgerald, who was Owen's one of the guys who drew the Bob Hope comic book in its early days, among other
Oh,
things.
okay.
And another very wonderful artist I got to work with. But
Oops.
artists have different skills. I'm a member of the Magic Castle, and I know a lot about magicians. I know a lot of magicians. I do some magic, and nobody appreciates magicians like other magicians because they are aware of how difficult some of those things are to do.
Yeah.
You sit there amazed at you see a guy do this and you go, "That's an amazing trick that guy just did." And another magician looks at it and goes, "My God, that's 5 years of practice." He's aware of how hard it is to do that particular move,
Yes.
to physically do the moves necessary to so artists appreciate other artists that way. And Sergio is one of those guys that other people look at and just go, "I don't get how he does it." And he's that way towards the Dan Spiegels of the world and the Dave Stevenses as well.
Right. He can
Sergio,
appreciate. Yeah, he appreciates the differences in their style, but like, sir, what Sergio does.
yeah,
How do you
Sergio
explain it? What he is?
well,
Where does this come from?
he's a purely organic cartoonist. There are guys in this business who become artists because they learn how to draw. It's not something that comes naturally to them. They looked one day and they went, "Gee, I want to be part of comics." In the last few years, we've seen people who've gotten into comics because they heard how much Rob Liefeld made off it,
Yeah.
or
Well,
Todd McFarlane, and they also saw the chance for some celebrity. There are people in this world who become whatever they become because they want to be famous. Um, and So they taught themselves how to draw, and sometimes these are the kind of people who become inkers or letterers more than artists who start with the blank page. But you can there are also people who draw just because they have to draw. And Sergio is a compulsive drawer. He and I would sit in restaurants and he's just drawing on the napkin all the time. We one time were at a Sizzler restaurant. This is 20 years ago, and the lady there knew who we were because went down there a lot. The restaurant's gone, but she knew who we were. And Sergio was talking about how he had done a lot of free sketches at a convention and seen them all turn up on eBay a couple of days later. And he was a little annoyed by that. And you understand if you give someone, an autograph, and under the pretense it will be a treasured keepsake for them, it's a little disconcerting to find it on eBay a week or two later. So he was talking to me how he decided he was going to be not going to do more free sketches for people. And while he's saying this to me, the hostess at the Sizzler comes up to us with a piece of paper and a pencil, and she asked Sergio if he could draw Alfred E. Newman for her. And without realizing what he was doing, he took the page and he started drawing Alfred E. Newman as he was telling me he wasn't going to do free sketches for people again. And this woman was not paying for this. Well, she gave us like 10% off on the Malibu chicken at Sizzler. But he's just drawing. It's just part of who he is.
And I've seen him draw. I've seen him. He's done when he does a sketch and he does a drawing. It's not like he does a layout or it's just he sees it and he draws it.
Sergio and I did a couple of chalk talks for kids about cartooning, and he would get up there and draw what he draws, and I would get up there and teach the kids how to draw Scooby-Doo or Bugs Bunny. And I am a very slow, labored cartoonist. It doesn't come naturally to me. It's something I kind of learned how to do because I just wanted to, bond with Bugs Bunny by drawing him. So I do it slowly and meticulously, and I draw a barely adequate Bugs Bunny. And my Bugs Bunny today is just as good as my Bugs Bunny was when I was 13.
That's good to hear.
Any better. But so what happens is what I'm conscious of is that Sergio is 8,000 times the cartoonist I am. But when the kids watch me do it, it looks humanly possible. There is no way they can learn anything watching Sergio.
Yes.
If he's drawing a character, he might start with a foot and then add a person on top of it. Or he might draw a fire hydrant and then draw the person opening the fire hydrant and then make him a fireman, and whatever it is, it just comes out of nowhere. Whereas when I do it, you see the sweat, you see the construction line.
Yes.
So I can say to the kids, if you want to draw Charlie Brown, you draw a circle and you put this here and you put that there and you divide the space like this. And Sergio just goes, there's Charlie Brown.
There's Charlie Brown.
Yeah.
Well, so, and on top of being phenomenal, world-class cartoonist, no doubt about it, he's just one of the most interesting, he's the most interesting man in the world. Dos Equis needs to hire that guy.
Sergio is amazing. I'll tell you something he does that I find amazing. We haven't done this for a long time, but we used to go to conventions in weird cities. And at some point, we would be walking around a touristy area. Like we were up in Victoria, British Columbia, and there was this inlet on the ocean, and there was this beachside little space where a lot of tourists were there. And there are kids who sit there drawing caricatures for money. You've seen these in places. They have them all over Las Vegas. They're all down in Las Vegas. There's a whole bunch of them downtown on Fremont Street, and there's a bunch of them in this big little community outside Bally's Hotel, and they will draw your caricature for $20 or $30 or whatever. And they all have samples of their drawings up there, and the drawings are all swipes from Mort Drucker and Tom Richmond or Jack Davis. And Sergio would see these kids, and he would make a point of going over and introducing himself to them. And they all knew who he was, every one of them without exception. And they were all shocked. I think one of them even asked to see his ID. He couldn't believe that Sergio Aragones would come over and talk to him. And he gave them encouragement, because this is the bottom end of cartooning. It is the lowest rung of what you can do to make money drawing cartoon. And if they're drawing caricatures of people, they probably dream of working for Mad Magazine, or did when there was a Mad Magazine.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are people now who are successful commercial cartoonists who are making very good livings, who were encouraged to keep going by meeting Sergio on this one occasion. It was a major thrill for them, and he would give them encouraging words, and he would tell them that their work was good, which it was. He wasn't lying to them. He was. Most of these kids were pretty good. Nobody had discovered them yet. Nobody had figured out a way they could appear in a job that paid more than $20 a head.
And what they know him from, what I'm gonna wager that 90% of the people who know who Sergio Aragones know him from Mad Marginals.
Yes.
To literally be like a marginalized, to be thrust over, not into the corner, right?
But here's the thing.
To really be the winner, be the thing that I want to read every one of those in every Mad magazine. I might skip some of the features, but I'm reading every marginal.
Well, when Sergio got into Mad, I started reading Mad magazine with issue number 70. And I loved it so much, I started hitting secondhand bookshops. And by the time issue number 71 came out, I had all the back issues of the magazine issues of Mad. I found them all in secondhand
Okay.
bookshops back then for a dime a piece. This is obviously not recent. Um, so when Sergio got in, and up until Sergio got into Mad, the marginals were text gags. The editors would write these little, or Frank Jacobs would write these
Yeah.
little
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
gags that would be stuck in the margins or between panels and things like that. And when Sergio invented the marginals, there's an example of creating, not only doing a job, but creating it in the first place. He was the one who had the idea to put drawings there. And he went into, he had already sold Mad a couple of pages. And Mad never bought more than 2 or 3 pages from one person for any issue. I think Mort Drucker might do 6, and Dave Berg would do 3, and whatever it was. And Sergio had already sold them as much material as they would buy from him. So he had to find a new place to draw in Mad. So he drew in the margins, and he goes to them. He took he drew a couple of these magical cartoons, really tiny, the size that they're now reproduced, but he drew them that size originally. And he
Yeah.
draws them
Yeah.
larger, and they reduce them. And he pasted them to a copy of Mad, and he showed them to the editors. And at first, they didn't notice them. And then he's pointed it out, and they went, "Oh!" And they saw how it would look, and they thought, "Hey, that's not bad." Um, and Al Feldstein, who was the editor at the time, went, "Hey, let's give this a try for an issue. We can't do it very
Yeah.
long because obviously he can't come up with 12 gags an issue every month."
Right.
And Sergio proceeded to come up with 12 gags an issue every month for 40 years or whatever it was. I mean,
Right. And
you know,
funny gags, like
yes,
funny,
right,
clever. You have to think about them. They're almost a puzzle to get the joke on some of them,
yeah,
but amazingly hard to do that. And at that scale and for so
yeah.
long.
And he freed the editors up from having to write those gags every issue, which is one
Yes.
of the reasons they loved it, and the readers loved it. So it's one thing if you see a job there and you find that you fill it. It's another thing to create the job and fill it, to create your own job.
Okay. Well, so let's talk about this comic. Let's talk about Gru and just tell me where it came from.
Sergio had been doodling Gru for several years. Sergio was often over in Europe, being feted by the great cartoonists of France and England and Spain and every place he went. And most of those guys owned their own characters. Most of those guys had a comic character that appeared someplace, and they were the sole owner of it. And Sergio had dabbled in American comic books. He'd done some stuff for DC, and he was aware that at DC or Marvel, if he created a comic book for them, he would not own it. And he wanted to own it not just for financial reasons, but because he wanted to control the character. He wanted it done his way, and he wanted to take it any place he went. So he started creating ideas, just doodling.
And just to be clear, at that time, creator ownership in American comics was not common.
At that time, if you walked into DC or Marvel with a brand new comic book that they wanted to publish, they would tell you, they would make clear to you, understand that they would own it. And you'd say, "Well, I want to own it." And they said, "No, no, you can't own it. A copyright has to be the name of a company. It's not valid if the artist's name is on it." And Sergio knew that was not true. There was an immense amount of, I think the technical term for this is lying, by people in the business division. They would tell Sergio flat out, "No, no, it's no legal way you can own it. We can't publish it if we don't own it." And Sergio would say to them, "But you publish Tarzan, you don't own Tarzan. You publish Star Wars, you don't own." This is before Star Wars, but he would cite the examples how they were publishing characters they didn't own.
Of course.
And then they say, "Well, that is owned by a company. It's owned by a corporation, and you're not a corporation." And Sergio would say, "Well, what if I form a corporation?" "No, no, it would not be legally
Yeah.
valid. And besides," and this is a key thing, they would say, "The money in doing comics is in merchandising, and no one will ever buy a character from for merchandising from an individual. They have to buy it from a company. And he knew that was ridiculous. So he decided to create his own character. And he came up with an idea for a strip, which was basically a parody of Tarzan. And he worked on it and he's developing and doing ideas and things. And then one day, a movie came out. He saw an animated movie that was literally playing on a theater marquee for a funny Tarzan that someone had done in the early 70s or early 80s. No, mid 70s, I guess. And he said, "Well, I can't do that." So he switched over and he started doodling this barbarian character. And it evolved over a period of like 2 years or so, during which time Sergio was doing a lot of work for a man named George Schlatter, who was a TV producer, best known for the TV show Laugh-In and later for Real People. And when he revived the new
Ah.
Laugh-In in 76 or 77, the one that everybody remembers as being without Rhoda Martin but with Robin Williams in it, he made Sergio a cast member. Sergio was actually on camera as one of the comedians.
Ah.
And Sergio also did cartoon graphics for that. So we have a pile of early primitive Gru sketches on George Schlatter stationery. And Sergio was just doing this character. And he did one 2-page story all by himself because at that point it was a solo project. And one day, my friend Steve Gerber was deep in debt over a legal battle he had with Marvel over the character Howard the Duck. And this was a case where Steve might have lost that case or had to abandon it simply because it was costing him too much. Marvel was outspending him. In fact, at one point, the judge sanctioned Marvel for doing certain moves that were intended to drive up Steve's legal costs, and they made Marvel reimburse him for a few $1,000s of legal costs. But that still didn't wipe out the debt. So a nice fellow named Dean Mullaney, who was running Eclipse Comics, this was the early days of Eclipse, said, let's do a benefit comic book. So we did this book called Destroyer Duck, and we rounded up our friends, and Jack Kirby drew a 20-page story for no money in it, which Steve wrote, called Destroyer Duck. And for the backup features, we just gathered up contributions, and I went to Sergio, and I told him about the book, and he said, whatever you want, I will do. And I said, I want Gru. I want to print the Gru story on there. And he gave it to me, and we printed it. And then when the book came out, making Steve, a lot of money, enough to pay a few legal bills, and eventually settling his lawsuit.
And this was through Pacific Comics. Is that correct?
No. The Destroyer Duck was done by Eclipse.
Ah, okay.
This is before Pacific was involved with Gru. And
I see.
Sergio got a lot of calls from people saying, when's the next issue of Gru? When can we see a whole issue of Gru? We want to see Gru. So he came to me one day and he asked me to be his collaborator because he felt he needed someone to help him with the dialogue and also to kind of put the comic together, who knew how to deal with production and getting things to the printer and stuff like that, which I knew because I did that on Destroyer Duck. I was the guy who sent Destroyer Duck to press. It's interesting when Destroyer Duck was announced, there was a guy at Marvel, and I emphasize this was a guy at Marvel. This was not Marvel. This was just one of the low employees who said, "You can't do that. You can't produce a comic book without a company. You need a production department. You need a whole staff." We put this together in my bedroom with Destroyer Duck #1 because I was doing that. I was editing comic books for Hanna-Barbera at the time, and before that I did it for the Edgar Rice Burroughs people. I did it here. I did it in this office. I did it from my old apartment. I could do the lettering corrections myself. We could stat the work. We could send it out. It was possible to do a comic book. There was a moment. There's a time not that long ago when if you describe what you're doing right now
Yes.
to someone and said, this is what I'm going to do. And they're going to go, you need a TV studio for this. You need
Yes.
cameramen. You need switchers. You need editors. You need a staff of 80 people to do this.
You do. And you need a graphics department for stingers like that.
Right. Yeah. Yes. And that's just before anybody invented StreamYard and whatever editing programs you use and, Adobe and other things like that. We now have the capability on our computers to be channel 13. We have the
Yes.
capability to be Marvel Comics.
Yes.
We have that capability. Well, we produced Destroyer Duck, and then Sergio wanted to do a book of Gru, and we talked about different ways of publishing it. He was thinking of publishing it himself and things like that. And Pacific Comics was just really opening up at that time. And he called Steve Shanus, or maybe it was Bill Shanus. I don't think he remembers which one he called, and or maybe I called them. Whatever it was, we had a lot of conversations with them, and they published Gru. And if the company had stayed solvent, they would have continued publishing it. But that's a whole other
But
story.
Steve and Bill Shannis were not feeding you any lines about creator ownership. That was central to their business model at Pacific, was they wanted you to own the comics,
Well,
right?
that was the way you lured some of these people in. I mean, you couldn't compete with Marvel and DC in terms of a page rate up front, and there were people who didn't want to work for something like Pacific Comics because their dream was to write Batman or draw Spider-Man. They couldn't give you that. And there are people in this industry who are very happy working on other people's characters. So, reference back to the Jack Kirby anecdote I told you
Oh,
earlier. The Kirby tradition is to create a new comic. Well, some people think the Kirby tradition is to, draw the Thing.
right.
So, so they had wound up with a line which consisted of Jack Kirby, Neil Adams, Mike
Well,
Grell,
they
Dave
couldn't get any big
Stevens.
names. They couldn't
Yeah,
get any talent on this. On
yeah,
this, I mean,
and
the
these
books
people.
that they put out were amazing books from Pacific
That's right.
Comics.
And yeah, and wonderful comics. And the thing was, I know there are people who think creator ownership is a little hinky in different ways, and like, oh, it's because the artist just wants to keep all the money for himself. No, I think the number one reason is they want to keep the control for themselves. They want to
Mm.
have the final word on their own creation, the way Charles Schultz had it on Peanuts, the way Gary Trudeau has it on Doonesbury, the way Milton Caniff had it on the newspaper strips he did. And here's the key thing: Pacific Comics wound up, in bankruptcy. If Pacific Comics had owned Gru, Gru would have gotten sold in a bankruptcy court.
Right.
Somebody else would own it, not Sergio. And God knows what they'd do with it, or who'd write it, or who'd draw it, whatever. But because Sergio had ownership, we were able to take Gru first to Eclipse, then to Marvel, then to Image, now to Dark Horse. And after we put Dark Horse out of business, we'll take it someplace else. But Gru will
Uh-huh.
just go along sinking companies as he has done ships. And
Which you did. You hopped from Pacific and then made a move towards. Then Marvel somehow said, "Hey, we're missing the boat. We
well,
want
yeah,
these creators, right?"
what happened was that we did an issue for Pacific that they could not print. They could not afford. When they stopped publishing, there was a complete issue of Gru ready to go. It was a special, extra long issue. And Murphy, you remember Murphy Anderson, the great comic book artist
Yes.
Murphy
Sure. Of
Anderson had a
course.
company that was doing color separations, making the engravings. And
Yes.
I was approached by a lady named Carol Kalish, who was head of circulation at Marvel. She was very much responsible for a lot of success Marvel had in the marketplace.
Extremely well beloved in the direct
Beloved,
market, in the foundation of the direct market, and what
yes,
happened
yeah,
in comics.
yes, a great lady. A tragic loss when we lost her. But she came
Yes.
to me and she said the epic line is, coming up. And I went to Archie Goodwin, who was the most beloved editor of the industry at the time, I think, and most trusted. And we want Gru. So we started talking about that. And I said, we've got this issue that is all ready to print, and Murphy Anderson hasn't been paid for doing all the color separations on it. Would you start with that? Would you start by publishing that? And they said, no, we can't adapt the format of the separations. Technically, they couldn't use his separations, but Eclipse could, because Eclipse was using the same printer that Pacific was using. So I went to Dean Mullaney and said, we want to print a Gru special. And we essentially printed the Gru special with him because that way Murphy got paid. The book got printed and Murphy got paid. And then we went to, we closed the deal with Marvel. And then at the time, people were complaining about creator-owned comics because they never came out on time. We
Yes.
proceeded to do 120 issues of Gru in 120 months, never missed a deadline, never had a fill-in, never were close to being late with an issue. And we also did 2 graphic novels in there and a couple of other special things for them.
Yes. Let me
And
tell you, the consistency was a big part of it. Like for Gru back in those days, like you said, 10 years coming out on every month, every single month. It was like there was no reason. You never gave us a reason not to buy Gru, right? Like there's plenty of reasons to stop. Oh, I've waited 6 months. I haven't seen anything. Oh, a new mini series, a new #1, whatever. It was like, now here's Gru number 99. See you next month for number 100. I loved it.
We were ahead of schedule most of the time, and even if we weren't, we never missed a deadline. That is partly because of Sergio's speed. It's partly because of my speed. A lot of it is because of a man named Stan Sakai who lettered the book. And in the history of comics, there's Stan on the left in that little photo there.
Yeah.
The unsung hero is the letterer because he can be the roadblock where nothing gets done for a long time if he can't turn the pages around instantly.
Right, because they're the last touch, right?
Well, they're the middle touch. Sergio would
okay.
The comic gets drawn in pencil roughly, and then Stan letters it, and Sergio can't finish the art until Stan does that. And then the book would go to Tom Luth for coloring, and Tom Luth, I called him the hardest working man in comics. He really was. He's now kind of getting into more music stuff now, but he's still doing some coloring.
I thought he had retired just recently. I thought he retired.
He's semi-retired. He's still coloring some stuff for us. We don't know when it will end. I would like to keep him forever, but he's doing some wonderful things with music. I just heard a thing he wrote that a symphony orchestra in Europe recorded that was just brilliant. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, that's too good. I don't want him to succeed as a composer. I want him coloring. But the physical, the number of hours that he put in are staggering. That's Tom with the mustache. One of the 2 people with a mustache. And that's a picture taken in Sergio's old studio. I think that was the first group shot of the Gru crew. The pages, I think, that Stan is holding are Pacific Comics pages. The page he's holding, I believe, and Sergio is holding a Pacific Gru. I don't think there were any Epic Grus yet at this time.
Okay.
And I am, wearing a jacket I cannot fit into now, and I have hair I don't have anymore. But we were just a very fortuitous combination of 4 guys who were very good and diligent workers.
How do you end up, though, Mark? You got a master cartoonist drawing. You're like, okay, we need letters. Who do I go to? How about I get another guy who's destined to be? I don't know if I'm going to say. I said Sergio was the #1 treasure, but I'm going to say Sergio and Stan are just about.
Stan is absolutely amazing. At the time, we asked him. Sergio is the one who asked him to letter Gru. He saw some of Stan's work at a CAPS meeting of this group we had of cartoonists, and at that time, Stan was not yet Stan Sakai. At that time, lettering somebody else's work was not beneath him. And I think Stan would tell you, if you had him here, and there's no earthly reason you shouldn't have him on this show, that working on Gru inspired him, working with Sergio inspired him to come up with his own character. And he's always been terrific. A couple of times, I couldn't believe how fast he got stuff lettered. There was one time we were so close to the deadline, not on Gru, but on another project, I think. I drove the pages out to Stan, who was then living in Pasadena, and literally drove him to his house. And his then wife kind of greeted me like, oh, pages. Oh, yes, he's going to be lettering them on our anniversary. I felt so bad. But he did that. There's a devotion here. One of the things I learned from Jack Kirby, and I've told this story many times, and I will tell it many, many more times in the future because it's key to my life and to knowing about Jack. I looked at Jack one day, and Jack worked very, very hard. Jack worked very long hours. He worked 7 days a week. He would work till 4 a.m, and then he'd be back at the drawing board by noon, maybe. And start on something else. much harder than he had to. I would see
Yeah.
Jack finish a page that anyone else would have turned in with pride, and he'd go,
Yeah.
"Nah, I didn't do
Yeah.
this right," and he'd start erasing panels on it and improving it. And I said to myself, Mark, you're never going to have the genius of this man because nobody is. It's ridiculous. Nobody. There's not going to be another guy with this man's facility for creativity and concepts and just thinking. Not just be outside the box, but outside the box that holds the box that holds the box that holds the box. But it might be possible to work that hard. You you can maybe do. You could maybe match
Yeah.
Jack in
Yeah.
effort and
Yeah.
hours. It's one of the few areas you can compete. And I think at times I did that. I also drew the Superman's emblem better than Jack. It's the only thing I drew. Sometimes would draw the Superman emblem on the Jimmy Olsen comics, and I did that better than Jack. It's the only thing I ever drew better than anybody.
Okay,
Um,
wait a minute. Speaking of people drawing over Jack,
yeah,
I know, Mark, I don't know how much time you have left. I know you had an appointment coming up.
we've got
But
we're okay. We're okay right now. We're okay.
okay,
Keep going.
tell me a little bit about what it meant to Jack when they erased his Superman faces
Um,
and had them redrawn. Am I telling that correctly?
yeah. Basically, Jack handed in when Jack started working for DC. He the first three things he did, aside from a little cover here and there, was Forever People #1, New Gods #1, Mr. Miracle #1, and then he turned his attention to Jimmy Olsen. They did not come out in that order, but they were done in that order. And in the first Forever People, Superman guest starred, and Superman was on the cover. And a man named Frank Giacoia inked the cover of that first Forever People, and he left Jack Superman intact. And he was supposed to ink the insides, but they made a left turn and gave it to Vince Coletta. Coletta made a deal to ink all of Jack's work for DC. Um, and I thought that was a bad choice. I thought it was bad to have anyone in that position quite like that, but particularly a guy working for New York, a guy Jack was ostensibly the editor, but to Vince Coletta, the editor was the DC Comics guys. And if he pleased them, he didn't care what Jack thought, which made sense because those are the ones giving him the work, writing him the paycheck, and giving him other work too. He was working for DC and other stuff. Incredibly, um, when Mike Royer took over inking Jack's stuff, he was lettering and inking pages as fast as Jack could pencil them. This is almost not humanly possible. And uh, I mean, Frank Giacoia or Joe Sinnott or any other Kirby inker you name could not have lettered and inked just could not have done that much
Sure.
work. And
Although the tightness of Kirby's pencils must help somewhat.
Yes, but there's also a lot of stuff in there. And
Yeah.
also, it just takes time to letter comics. It's a labor intensive job. This was hand lettering. There's no computers involved back then, and it is very fortuitous that Mike Royer was available, that he was local and he was available because there was no second choice. If Jack wanted the books finished in Southern California, where he could keep an eye on them and they'd be turned into him before they went to New York, um, then we needed someone local who would be answerable to Jack and not to the corporate overlords at DC. And if Mike had not been available, there was no second choice. And Mike happened to be, he's a friend of mine already. I knew him for a couple of years at that point. One of the most reliable guys who ever worked in comics. I worked for Gold Key Comics for a number of years, and my editor there was a man named Chase Craig, who edited as many comic books as any human being alive, if not more. And I asked him one time, just as we were talking, I said, who's the most reliable writer and artist you ever had? And this is of maybe 300, 400 different possibilities. And for the writer, he said I was, which I think he only said because I asked him. Although I was pretty prolific with him for that stuff. And for the artist, he said it's a tie between Dan Spiegel and Mike Royer. And he said, this is almost exactly a paraphrase. If Mike Royer says he'll be at 2 o'clock with the pages, at 2:05 we start calling the police and say, has there been an accident?
Huh.
That's the kind of guy Mike was. And it was because of how hard he was willing to work. It was also because he would do something that an awful lot of other people in this business would not do. He would turn down better paying work.
Hmm.
If you were hiring Mike to do a job that paid $1,000, and somebody went to him and said, Mike, I'm desperate for you to do this. Can you put that aside and be late with it and do my job for 5,000? Mike would say, I'm sorry, I have a deadline to meet. I've made a promise.
Yeah.
I will not do that. And you know, I told that example in front of a room full of artists one time, and all of them said, "Well, I wouldn't turn it down. I wouldn't turn it." It's just.
I feel like that's an inker thing. I know Mick Gray and guys like that. They know that they are more fungible than a penciler. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like if they are reliable, they're going to have work forever. But the second they miss that deadline, they're putting
Well,
future work in question.
the thing was in Mike's case, DC was skeptical when Jack said, "I want my guy in Southern California." They went, "You can't have an anchor in Southern California. He's got to work for us here." It's very much like
Okay.
that what I said earlier about you can't produce edit a comic book
Yes.
outside an
Yes.
office. The editors were willing to put up with Jack Kirby being out of town and one or two other people. This is
Right.
before there
Yeah.
was
Yeah. Yeah.
FedEx. This is before
Yeah.
Federal Express, remember. And it was also before DC was shipping stuff to the Philippines. Once they were sending comic books to the Philippines to be inked, it didn't seem like that horrible a thought to send them to Los
Right.
Angeles.
Sure.
But at that time, they wanted Coletta. And it was kind of like, okay, we'll let Jack have the guy he wants. That guy will screw it up, and Coletta will get the books back because we want them done here where we have control. So if Mike had missed even one deadline, he probably would have been off the book
Because Coletta, for everything, he had a rep for shipping.
well, Coletta got the stuff in on time. I think people
Yeah.
exaggerate. I feel bad about some of the dumping on Mr. Coletta that is done by people.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think he was the wrong anchor for Jack, and that's a decision that editors make all the time. It's not unique to this book. I have people coming like, "Wait
Yeah.
a minute, you don't replace the inker." I said, Marvel and DC replace inkers 3 times a week. This is not a usual thing. And Vince just moved over to other books. His income didn't
Yeah.
suffer.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not a big deal. But they say, well, he kept inking all the books at the last minute. He was saved all these deadlines. Well, I'm sure he did that occasionally, but the guy was inking like 6 comics a month
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
ones every month. They weren't all late. Mike Grell was not late with every issue of Warlord that Vinnie Coletta inked, and Jack was not late with every issue of Thor. Jack was never late with Thor,
Right.
or whatever it was. I mean, it is admirable to get a book done and overnight if when necessary for shipping. I'm not knocking that. I just don't think it happens as often as as sometimes people over dramatize.
Yeah.
But
I hear you.
yeah, so Jack was doing started doing Jimmy Olsen, and as more people around the office saw the pages, somebody probably in the licensing division said, "That doesn't look like our Superman." So one day I got a fanzine in the mail, Donna Maggie Thompson's Newfangles, and it said Al Plastino was retouching Jack Kirby's work. Nobody had told this to Jack. So Steve Sherman, my then partner, and I went out. We showed this fanzine to Jack, and he looked like Bill Bixby about to turn into Lou Ferrigno. He was furious. But one of the things I learned from Jack, and this, when I say one of the things, one of the millions, was you pick your battles. You can't win every battle. You can't fight over everything. You just have to put up with it. Jack never liked the coloring that DC did on his work. He really disliked it. He thought it was very bad coloring. And when they asked him what he wanted, he said, "I want it to look more like the Marvels." And they were shocked. Because to them, the Marvels were so inferior. DC had this attitude back then that everything at Marvel was garbage, and everything at DC was wonderful because it was DC.
Right.
It's fine to root for your own team, but
I mean, despite what the sales numbers were indicating.
oh, it's a fluke. Well, listen, I mean, in the TV business, I did a TV show for years called Welcome Back Cotter for ABC, And after uh, I left that show, my agent sent me in to write an episode of a show called What's Happening, which followed Cotter on Thursday night. We were on at 8 and they were on at 8:30. And around the Cotter offices, their attitude was, "Oh, What's Happening? That's a crummy show. It's only on it only gets numbers because people tune in to watch Cotter, and then it's too late to switch the channel and watch the end of the Waltons, so they watch this crummy What's Happening show." So I went into the What's Happening offices and met the people there. Very nice people,
That was a funny show,
fun
man.
people, and they said, "Now you worked on Welcome Back, Cotter," and they started telling me what a crummy show it was, and how it only had got ratings because people would sit through it because they wanted to watch What's Happening.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, you know, there's a certain loyalty to your own product here that I think gets pernicious. I think it gets realism is a nice thing. It's nice to live in the real world. Not a lot of people do these days if you read the newspapers, but you ought to have a grasp on reality. And
We have that problem in my industry, in the computer industry. We call it NIH syndrome, not invented here syndrome.
Yeah,
right? Like if
right.
we didn't come up with it, it's a dumb idea.
Yeah, and one of the funny things, I never had in my life in reading comic books, I never had even a third of my income, and usually a lot less, come from either DC or Marvel. I never was exclusive to anybody in my whole writing career, any place. But I certainly in comics was never a Marvel guy or a DC guy. So I'd visit the Marvel offices while I was back in New York and hear them all putting down DC as junk and terrible, and oh my God, look who they got doing Batman this month. And I go over to the DC offices and they'd be putting down Marvel and saying, "Oh my God, look who's drawing Spider-Man now." And I think, I'm glad I'm not caught up in that mass delusion. And it sounded like very funny when somebody got fired by one company and went to work for the other, and he suddenly had to completely reverse his opinion of everything.
Right, yeah, right.
So anyway, so DC felt there was nothing that they couldn't improve, especially if it looked like one of those Marvel books. And Superman, drawn by Jack Kirby, looked like one of those Marvel books to them. So they got an artist named Al Plastino, who was not drawing Superman at that time. They'd taken him off all the Superman books because they thought his work looked old and old-fashioned and tired. And they had him redrawing Jack Superman's and Jimmy Olsen's. And for a while, and then Murphy Anderson took it over. Murphy actually apologized to Jack in my presence one time for that, and Jack didn't blame him. You're only following orders. It's what your boss tells you to do. Jack did a lot of things that he didn't like in his career because his boss told him to do them. Because again, as I said earlier, Jack was all about making a good living for his family. And so
but was that a moment maybe where he regretted going over to DC at all? Like, did he start to see the writing on the wall that maybe he wasn't as respected as he should have been there?
I don't think DC used Jack properly. I don't think they treated him very well.
Right.
I don't think he had an alternative at that moment. Life is about alternatives. I don't believe you should say to someone, you shouldn't do that unless you can say what you should have done instead. It's very easy for me to say, Dan, you shouldn't be using that backdrop on your broadcast. You shouldn't be using that software. You shouldn't be doing that. And if you say to me, "Well, what should I use?" I go, "I don't know. Yeah. There must be something." Well, that's not helpful. So Jack at that moment did not believe, and I understand why this was the case, that he could make a living working for anybody but DC or Marvel. And people would come to me and say, "Why do you work for Charlton?" Well, if you saw what Charlton paid, you know why he didn't. And Jack thought Charlton. Jack thought Charlton was just Marvel with worse printing and lower page.
Right, but Ditko really embraced Charlton, right?
Ditko,
and really,
Ditko was a unique person, someone I respect greatly as an artist, but not as a human being. And Ditko, was doing his own what he wanted, and he judged a company by how much they left him alone, not how much they paid him, not how well they treated his work. And Ditko's put in an awful lot of work on, many Ghosts of Dr. Graves stories that no one remembers. While Jack at the same time was doing comics that are reprinted over and over again and beloved.
Yes.
you know, and I'm sure Ditko did not regret any of his choices in the world. He was very into making his own decisions about things, and uh, uh, he did what was right for him. It was not necessarily right for somebody else, and and Jack knew it was not right for him. So Jack went along with it. He went along. He was such a good sport about the Superman heads being redrawn that people at DC thought he was okay with it. He wasn't. He just had decided not to fight over that, as he had decided not to fight over the bad coloring or what he thought was bad coloring. Um, you look at what's important to you and you pick the fights you're going to win and the ones you're going to concede on, because you can't win every battle and you can't fight over everything. And uh, he was happy with a lot of stuff at DC. He was happy with a lot of the things the way books turned out. He was very proud of the New God series and very shocked when they aborted it suddenly.
Yeah.
And uh, did he regret going to Marvel, leaving Marvel for DC? At times, I think he did, but it was a question of, neither company was going to treat him very well at that moment. That's the business, the way the business was at that point, and it said something about the business.
And this was before his forays into animation, or
Yes,
am I? Yeah.
Yeah. Animation became Jack's escape route. Um, there's an awful lot of autobiographical stuff in Jack's work, and a lot of Mr. Miracle is about, is an escape artist, and it's about feeling trapped
Yeah.
in the oppressive situations he was in, and believing he could get out of them by being faster and stronger than anyone else. Uh, but Jack was not happy at DC for most of the time. He was just happier than he probably would have been at Marvel at that point, and sometimes
Yeah.
that becomes arguable. And neither one of them was, it's like, would you rather have measles or the mumps? Neither one is thrilling.
And this might be me this might just be me imagining things, but like it from everything I've read, it seemed like when he went into that animation world, the people there really respected what they had.
Yeah.
Like an idea machine, right?
Yeah, well, Jack's one of the things that was wonderful for Jack, first of all, he got one thing in the animation business he never got in 30, 40 years in comics. He got health insurance. And he shortly after that had a heart attack. So, that's a big step. I mean, it sounds like a minor point today, but if you got real sick with no insurance, your entire life would suddenly be affected, and your family's life, and your safety in your home, and all those things. People get wiped out by medical bills in this world. He also was working for something new. He had gotten into something else. He didn't feel a prisoner of Marvel and DC. He also, when he went into Hanna-Barbera, or he went into Ruby Spears, or he went into Patty Freeling, which were the three studios he worked for, really, in the animation business, there was always somebody running up to him, some artist going, "Oh my God, Jack Kirby! I read your work when I was when I was this age. My favorite comic book was, Fantastic Four or Challenge of the Unknown or whatever it was. I became an artist because of you." He was respected in a way that he was not respected at DC or Marvel.
That's what amazes me, really, because you would think a comics company, especially after everything he did at Marvel, and then to come to DC and for them to just sort of really just misuse what they had.
Yeah, I think, I am, one of the things I am fascinated about in the history of comics, and it's a topic we could talk about if you wanted to do another podcast someday, we could talk about for 2 hours easily, is my belief that most of the people in comics of the first generation, 40s, 50s, 60s, the guys who kind of were moving away in the 70s, replaced by people like me,
yes,
were very diligent, very talented, very underpaid, and when they did not do great work, it was usually the fault of either the editor putting them on the wrong book with the wrong inker or the wrong collaborator, or the fact that the financial realities of the business forced them into an area that they were not comfortable in. There were guys who should have been inking their own work because that was when it was the best, but the financial structure meant they made more money by only penciling. And there were guys who should have been doing war comics who were doing superheroes. Um, when I go on Facebook a lot, there's certain forums where you just see people just attacking artists, saying this guy was the most untalented moron who ever lived. And I think,
Yeah.
no, he was wonderful on this. He was not good on this. What was different? It wasn't him. It was the other factors. And also, like when people complain about Vince Coletta on Thor, and I was one of them. Vince Coletta did not, sneak into the Marvel offices at night and grab Thor and take it home and ink it overnight. Every issue of Thor that Vince Coletta inked involved Stan Lee or his surrogates saying, "Great job, Vinny. Here's the next issue. Keep it up." So why are we faulting him for the fact that to me that was not a good match of penciler and inker, and that he was not
Right.
the right guy to ink, being Jack or ink, whatever. Um, there was a place for Vince Coletta. I have the original art to a page of Hawkman that was penciled by Joe Kubert and inked by Murphy Anderson. I did a
Oh,
panel with the
nice.
two of these guys at WonderCon one year and brought the page out and had them sign it right in front of everybody. And it's a bad team. What's wonderful about Joe Kubert is not there. What's wonderful about Murphy Anderson isn't there.
Uh-huh.
It's not a
Uh-huh.
bad page because these guys had a certain minimum level of competence,
Right.
but it's not the best use of either one of them. And if you looked at this page and that's all you'd ever seen of them, you might think, well, gee, that Kubert guy isn't very good. That Anderson guy isn't very good. It's not a good
I see.
combination. They're working against each other because they were so different as artists, and their interpretation of the character was so different. So Murphy's sitting
Yeah.
there trying to turn Joe Kubert's design into his design, and it's not ends up not being Murphy's design, not being Kubert's design. It's kind of neither. It's a compromise, um, and this happens. If Harvey Kurtzman had not found his little niche in Playboy, doing little Annie Fanny, he might have wound up at Marvel inking Batman, inking Spider-Man, and people would go,
Oh,
"What
man.
an untalented jerk this guy is! He's ruining Ross Andrews' pencils." And it's not the guy. The guy is talented. The business just didn't have a place where he could exhibit it.
I think you're right. I think the other big difference between that generation gap, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the guys that came before you were pro artists, professional, like commercial artists, if you will, weren't super fans of comic books per se. Not all of them anyway. Whereas the generation that came after seemed to emerge more from the fandom
Well,
end.
these guys, those artists that you're talking about, were all fans of Milton Caniff, Chester Gould, Al Capp, Hal Foster, Alex Raymond,
Alex
Roy
Raymond.
Crane. I mean, and a dozen of those guys. And most of them got into comic books because they couldn't get into comic strips. Most of the guys who got into comics in the 40s were lovers of the newspaper strips in a way that nobody is today of newspaper strips.
Yes. Yes.
And they collected them and they clipped them out and they swiped them and they copied them, and they got into comic books because it was almost the same kind of job. It didn't have as much of an upside. You couldn't get as rich as Milton Caniff doing anything in comic books, but you could draw as well as him as some of these guys did. And they were guys who had grown up in the Depression, and they all had known the poverty of, I got to bring home a paycheck. They've got, I got to find a paycheck somewhere. And they were all afraid to not have a paycheck on Friday of some sort.
Huh.
So this is why they put up with drawing the wrong comics, being told they couldn't ink their own work, uh, uh, dealing with terrible deadlines, whatever it was, because the alternative was not, in most cases, to work for somebody who treated you better as an artist. The alternative was to go work on a loading dock someplace. And it
Right.
was,
Well,
to be there were guys who just loved the fact that they were sitting there all day drawing. If you were if you went into the business of plumbing, let's say you became a great plumber, you would have tons of inventory. You'd have tools, you'd have pipes, you'd have a truck full of every possible thing that could be screwed into everything else that conveys water. You'd have training, you'd have physical labor, you'd be crawling under houses, you'd be, deep in human excrement sometimes, shoveling up, baling things, and you'd have this incredible investment. And hopefully each week you would turn all of that effort and all of that inventory into something that yielded enough money to pay the rent and groceries for your family. A guy like Jack Kirby, a guy like any of these guys, they sat down in the morning in their home studios. They didn't have to get on a train and battle, commuter traffic or whatever. And they took blank paper and a pencil. In other words, nothing. And at the end of the
Yeah.
day, they had made something that would pay them $50 or $80. And that is a wonderful feeling. You had created something. You went to bed that night feeling, well, I earned $80 today. I earned,
Yeah.
or whatever it was, and I did something, and I drew, and I got better at it as an artist. And all these guys got better and better up to a certain point. And that is a reward for an artist. And the same thing is true of a writer. Almost everybody who wrote in comics for the first 30, 40 years of the business dreamed of getting out of comics. They all
Right.
had a novel they wanted to do. Some of them did them on the side. They all wanted to write TV shows or movies. Some of them made it. Some of them got so into the niche of writing comic books that they never really explored other fields. They got very comfortable because every week they could write X number of pages easily, hand it in, get a paycheck. Whereas to write a novel meant months and months of not being paid and having no guarantee it would sell. And that's a trap they got into. There's a couple of guys in comics that I encountered, writers, who the phrase self-loathing was not inapplicable
Mm.
because they just resented the fact that they were comic book writers and nothing else.
Were they successful comic book writers?
They're guys who made their living for 30 years writing comic books.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, you measure success by a lot of things. There are people who um, became writers hoping that they would become very famous. There are people in the business, who were more interested in becoming famous. They wanted to make a good living and make a lot of money, but being famous was even more important to them.
Right.
See Lee, Stan, close parentheses. And there were guys who, uh, it's like, yes, hi Stan, uh, just wanted to pay the rent, have a house, do right by their families, have a kid, get their kid through college, and at the end of the day, be able to watch football on the weekends and not have to draw out work all week. And there are guys who achieve that. You can make a very good living in comics but it was not that secure because for most of the comic book industry's history, companies going out of business was right around the corner, especially in the
Right.
50s.
Right.
And Jack and other guys had nightmares of that moment when the business was imploding because of the horror comics scare and because sales were plunging. And Jack had a prolonged period of very little income that scared the hell out of him, which is why he put up with some of the
I
abuses that
see.
he suffered at Marvel
Yeah, for
because
Depression era folks, that's got to be just a real consuming fear.
yeah, I'll tell you a story about Jack that is kind of interesting and explains a lot. I grew up in West Los Angeles, and we lived right near a street called Beverly Glen Boulevard, near a street called Santa Monica Boulevard. There's an intersection there, and at that time, it's not there anymore, but there was a big railroad trestle there. A train literally went over that intersection, and there was I don't know what you call it, a trestle, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So you went under the trestle to go up Beverly Glen. And we were near there all the time. And one night, a man named Ernie Kovacs, one of the great comedians who ever lived, uh, was driving on that intersection. The road was slippery. He reached for a cigar or something like that. His car skidded and he smashed into the trestle and was killed. It's about 4 blocks from where I live. So we were in that intersection all the time. And it's like, oh my God, you couldn't drive through it. I'm thinking, there's where Ernie Kovacs died. That's the intersection where this wonderful, brilliant comedian who, in his field was comparable to a Jack Kirby or a Harvey
Right.
Kurtzman in comics.
Innovator of
Okay.
in television. Yeah.
So in around 1970 or 71, when I was working for Jack, there was a documentary done about Ernie Kovacs' life, with clips and interviews and things like that. And my father watched it. Now my father was from the same rough age and background as Jack. He grew up in Connecticut instead of growing up in New York, but he was a Depression era kid, and he was unlike Jack, a guy who never found what he wanted to do for a living. My father ended up with jobs that he hated, and spent most of his life in a job he hated. But that generation had to do that often. So he watched this documentary, and there was a scene in there where they were talking about how when he died, Ernie Kovacs left his widow, Edie Adams, something like $4 or $5 million in debt because he had never saved anything and he had bought stuff and he had debts all over the place. He had lived a very, you know, he was paid, he was one of these guys who, if he was paid $30,000 for a job, he went out and bought a $50,000 car, something like that.
Sure.
And it was treated like, what a wacky, colorful character. He lived life to the fullest. That's the way to go. Just go out and deep in debt. And my father was furious at that. He thought, no, you don't do that. You take care you don't leave your wife bankrupt and about to lose the house. That is a despicable, horrible thing. I think he was, he just said that. And I understood it. I understood that because to my father, who died 20 years before his wife did, his lifelong one love, he was able, when he was in the hospital, he was able to kind of accept that he was dying because he knew that his wife would be taken care of.
Yes.
Because the house was paid off. They had accused money in the bank. They had proper insurance, and I was around. He knew if anything happened, I would take care of her. So he was peaceful in accepting the fact that he was probably dying.
Yes.
Now, a couple of days after my father had first, ranted about that documentary, I was out working with Jack, and Jack had seen the documentary about Ernie Kovacs also. Same thing, because he admired Ernie Kovacs, as Jack admired anybody who did things nobody had done before. You didn't impress Jack by showing him a neat drawing of, of Fantastic Four that looked kind of like he drew it. That did not impress him. If you had come up with brand new characters and a new style and a new approach, that impressed him. So I mentioned offhand that my father had what my father had said about Ernie Kovacs, and Jack exploded. It was the most emotional I ever saw him. He said, "Your father's right. Ernie Kovacs was no damn good. A man like that." And that was like Jack's worst nightmare, was not being able to leave his family well off.
Yeah.
Not to leave them money, not to leave them a home that was paid for, all those things. And I had to calm Jack down. It was the angriest I ever saw him. And he was, I thought he wanted to go dig up Ernie Kovacs' grave and, deface it or something like that for a minute there. But that was a motivating factor for Jack and all those guys in the Depression.
And little did Jack know. Do you think Jack, of all the predictions Jack made about like comics ascending into movies and everything else, do you think he ever thought one of his original pages would sell for the kind of money that we're seeing original Kirby artwork sell for?
Absolutely, yes. He also said, there will be that Thor and Spider-Man are billion-dollar properties. And
yes.
He said that to the people at Marvel. They thought he was demented.
Yes.
Jack had visions of things like that. What he didn't know was if he'd be around long enough to capitalize on it. He did not know. It was like he knew the business was going to change. When Jack was frustrated by the way the business worked, he knew it was going to change. But I mean, I get that.
I get that part.
He didn't know when.
I get that part. But like he could have sat there drawing pictures in the last year, like drawing original pages and just putting them in a stack, and now those things would be millions. He did
some of that, but it was more like immediate income. He needed the immediate income.
Yes.
I just it's. As you can see, I love to talk about Jack.
You do. And in fact, Mark, I want to, because we're almost out of time here. I know for you, we're pretty close. And there's one subject that we haven't even broached that I want to bring up real quick. If you don't mind, we don't have to spend a ton of time on it.
Okay, go ahead.
Cartooning giants. So we talked about Alex Raymond, the school of old school cartoonists that inspired these cartoonists. Well, you work for, that era has passed of the superstar newspaper cartoonists. There's maybe one or two still out there now. You work for one of them. Okay. You work for, I would say, probably the last remaining biggest newspaper cartoonist out there. Stripper, whatever you want to call Jim Davis.
Well, I would say that Gary Trudeau is still pretty revered. I would say that Mike Peters is pretty revered.
I'm just going to go number of papers though alone. I'm going to
Oh,
put
number of
Garfield on
papers.
top.
Number of papers. Nobody beats Garfield. I mean, it was.
That's what I mean. Like Dilbert maybe is up there, but like it's a different thing. Tell me a little bit about Garfield, please, and how you got involved with Jim Danis.
I was working a lot for CBS. I got into a niche where I was writing cartoon shows and a lot of pilots for different. I wrote pilots for all three of the networks at the time. I stopped. I did a lot for ABC, and then a woman named Judy Price, who was one of the senior executives there, moved over to CBS, and she kind of took me with her. So I did a lot of stuff for CBS for a while, and I did stuff. I did quite a few pilots, some of which I removed my name from because I didn't like the way
I know you did one of my
came out.
favorites, Dungeons and Dragons. I know you were involved with.
Yeah, I left my name on Dungeons and Dragons, yes. But I took my name off some other shows I will not identify at this time. But
I remember you from what? CBS Story Break, maybe with Bob Keeshan?
I wrote a lot of CBS Story Breaks. I mean, I know this isn't what you wanted to hear about right now, but it is fascinating to me how many people I watched as a kid and then got to know and work with.
Yeah.
As you may know, I am kind of obsessed with the movie. It's a mad, 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 mad world. I love the film. I am on the commentary track of the Criterion DVD.
It's my dad's favorite comedy movie.
It's my favorite movie in the world. And I, if people want to argue, I have people who feel they have to tell me they hate it, and I go, fine, you can hate it. Let me love it. I don't like your mother's meatloaf. Fine, let me alone.
Right.
But I got to work with Jonathan Winters. I got to work with Marvin Kaplan. I got to work with Buddy Hackett. I got to work with, like half the Don Knotts, half the cast of that movie. I got to either meet or work with. I got to hang out with Phil Silvers.
When they were still pretty funny too. They were still on it.
I actually one time had brunch with Phil Silvers at a delicatessen, and we were talking about Mad World, and he started to tell me a story about Milton Berle on the set. And with the perfect cue, the door opens and Milton Berle walks in, and he came over to say hello to Phil, and he sat with us for 10 minutes, and we talked about Mad World. I'm sitting there talking with Phil Silvers and Milton Berle about this movie I love. And also we were talking about the play Funny Happened with the Forum, which was originally written for Phil Silvers. And then he bowed out of it, and Milton Berle was going to do it for a while. And then ultimately Zero Mostel started on Broadway. So we were talking about both of these things, two of my greatest loves in the world. I had,
amazing,
Phil Silvers and Milton Berle there. So, but then, I'm doing the CBS Story Breaks, and they come to me and they say, Mark, we need you to write these intros for Bob Keeshan. So I go to
Captain Kangaroo, for those
of
you who don't know out there.
And I hung out with Bob Keeshan for a day at the studio, and then since he had nothing to do before his plane back to New York, I took him out to dinner that night. I took Bob Keeshan out to dinner and sat, and spent time ate dinner with Captain Kangaroo.
Does he get recognized on the street as Captain Kangaroo a lot?
He got recognized. It's interesting. He got recognized by his voice. He didn't look that much like Captain Kangaroo.
Right.
The way people remembered him in person. But we were sitting in this restaurant called RJ's in Beverly Hills, and the woman who was waiting on us kept saying, "I know you from someplace," and it was his voice that they recognized his voice, and finally she figured it out, and he said, "You can tell her as we leave," but she figured it out before we told her. But he was a lovely man. I got to. It's funny. I was at the licensing show in New York one year. It was a big thing. It's a big convention full of people, characters, and properties. And they had Buffalo Bob Smith there from the Howdy Doody Show, which is like the earliest TV show I can remember. Although I actually got to be good friends with Paul Winchell, who was my hero when I was a kid. I have in my living room exact replicas of Jerry Mahoney and Knucklehead Smith.
Oh,
and
cool.
Every time I walk in there and see them, I smile. And every time my cleaning lady walks in there and sees them, she screams. But so Buffalo Bob, he had a line. I'm getting way off subject here. I'm sorry.
No, keep going, Mark. I love it.
Line of people to get his autograph. He was sitting there in the fringe, the Buffalo Bob jacket with the fringe on it, signing autographs for people at a booth for a company that was merchandising Howdy Doody, which he still owned a large piece of.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool.
So I wanted to meet him, but the line was like 2 hours, and I wasn't going to stand in line 2 hours. So I went past, and then a little later, I'm walking past the booth, and somebody who worked for King Features Syndicate, which was allied with the Howdy Doody effort, says, "Hey, Mark, come here a second. Meet Buffalo Bob. Come on." So they take me around to the back of the booth, and they brought me in, and Buffalo Bob is sitting at this table with him. Just imagine the line of people snaking through the convention center, and he's signing stuff, and they come up behind, and they go, "Bob, we want to interrupt you for a second. This is Mark Evanier, who does the Garfield cartoon shows." And Buffalo Bob shakes my hand and won't let go of it. You know, these people, they put another hand on top of your hand, so that they're shaking like this the whole time, and you can't stop shaking their hand. And he goes, "I love Garfield. God, you guys are terrific. You are wonderful with that." And of course, he's never seen anything I've done. He just loves Garfield. So we were talking, and I, of course, said the stupid things that everybody says to him about how I remember watching the show, and I remember this you did, and I remember that, and I remember how much
Clarabelle, that Clarabelle moment.
And you know who the original Clarabelle was?
The weathercaster guy, right?
No.
He was Ronald McDonald. McDonald.
That's right.
Who?
The original
Who
Clarabelle was Bob Keeshan.
Yeah, right.
That's Keeshan
okay.
Was
yes,
Clarabelle.
Of course.
And all the time he's talking to me, I'm looking, and the people in the line are angry, want to kill me because they've been waiting 2 hours, and all of a sudden this guy cuts in the line. And I felt very bad. So I said, "Well, thank you. I know you want to get back to the line here." And they go, "No." And he says, and I love when Garfield is eating the lasagna and stuff like that. I go, and so I'm going, "Just let me go so these people don't tar and feather me." And I said to him, "Fine, listen, I really would love to talk to you some more, but you got a huge line here, and I really don't want to inconvenience those people." And Buffalo Bob, I swear to you, he pulls me real close so he can whisper to me. And he says, "You don't understand. I'm trying to keep the line as long as I can." And I thought,
to be a bigger draw,
yeah, because he's out there. He's in a room full of people who are likely to license the rights to Howdy Doody, and it ain't gonna hurt if they see he's got a 2-hour line to get his autograph.
I love it.
So anyway,
no flies on Buffalo Bob.
Yeah. So I was writing different shows for CBS. I did the pilot. I wrote the pilot in development for a cartoon show starring Michael Jackson, who I had to go out and actually meet with Michael Jackson, which was a very strange time.
Did you get to meet Bubbles?
Yes, I got the tour of the whole menagerie. Yeah. I got the tour. I got to meet all of those characters. And at one point, he's showing me around this like mini Disneyland he has in his backyard. And he turns to me, and one of the things they told him was that I had written the Richie Rich cartoon show. And he turns to me and he says, "I just love Richie Rich." And I said, "Michael, you are Richie Rich." and he kind of looked at me like, "Oh, maybe I am." So I walked off that show. I moonwalked off that show. I got tired of it for, again, this is a half-hour story, but I quit it. I went to CBS and said, "This show's not going to work. Maybe there's somebody else who can turn this into a show you want to, but I can't turn this into a show that I think should be on the air. And I will give back the money you've paid me." And Judy Price, this nice lady there, says, "Instead of give me back the money, Mark, why don't you write another pilot for us?" And I said, "You got something?" She said, "Yeah, Garfield." Jim Davis had done, and he had written the maybe 8 or 9 Garfield primetime animated specials, a couple of which won Emmys. CBS desperately wanted a Garfield Saturday morning show because the testing showed that there was no character in the world more popular with their target demographic that wasn't owned by Disney or Warner Brothers. Garfield was available, it was unencumbered, and they wanted it. And Jim said, "I won't do it because I can't I don't have time to write, a series, and I don't trust."
And he's pretty stringent about quality control on anything Garfield related, right?
Yeah. I was so impressed with Jim when I got to working with him. He had this. I would fly back to Muncie, Indiana, where he had his offices there. They're now not there anymore. They're being downsized. As is everything.
Pause Inc.
But and there was a conference room. It was like a Garfield museum. There was one of every piece of Garfield merchandise that had been done, and they were all high quality, and they were
Yeah,
all beautiful.
yes.
And over on this side, there was a little display of all the stuff he'd rejected, and it was full of stuff that anybody else would have passed. When I worked for Hanna-Barbera, one of my little pains was that they didn't, if you could make, turn Yogi Bear into a moose if you were paying to put him on a t-shirt. They didn't care. They would actually, if it was necessary for new artwork to be generated for a piece of merchandise, they would hire the cheapest artist they could get. So, because when they build your company, you would not have a huge cost, and maybe you would be more likely to renew your contract. In other words, you've got to make a profit off your Yogi Bear merchandise, so we won't encumber you
I
with
see.
paying $3,000 for artwork. We'll charge you 200, and we'll hire this guy. So that's why there's so much bad looking Disney Hanna-Barbera merchandise. And while I was
Off-model
yeah,
Flintstones
that's right, yeah.
figures and everything.
And while I was sitting there with Jim going over plans for the show, one of his assistants came in with the prototype for a Garfield plastic alarm clock. It was like an alarm clock, and Garfield was like draped over it, asleep on top of it. And the assistant comes and says, "I'm sorry to interrupt you, but they need to go ahead. They're going to start making these next week, and this is the prototype they sent over you. Will you okay this?" And Jim looked at him and go, "No." He pulled up Sharpies. I told them to move the eyes, and he drew on it. The eyes move over here. The eyes have to be separated more. The eyes are wrong. And the assistant said, it'll cost them $10,000 if they don't go to press this week with it. And Jim said, "So?" And I could have, he almost got a big wet one on the lips right that moment there. I said, "This is a guy I want to be in business with. I love this." And there was never Garfield lasagna, frozen lasagna.
Yeah,
You never saw
which is
Garfield frozen
amazing.
lasagna because every damn company in the world that could make frozen lasagna thought about that, and they approached Jim, and Jim said, "Send me a sample of the lasagna you want to put Garfield's name on." And they would send him a crate of frozen lasagna, and they'd
Yeah.
have this. They had a chef there, and they had the chef prepare it for the staff, and everybody would come in and eat it and take one bite and throw it away, and Jim would say no.
Oh man.
He'd never found a frozen lasagna he thought was any good. And he
The
wanted
Stofers
Garfield.
people never came to the table?
I don't know the specifics of it, but he never
Oh,
found.
okay.
He never got approached by anyone who made a lasagna he thought was good enough. And if you watch
Well,
the Garfield show, there's an episode I kind of wrote about that.
oh, okay.
I kind of turned that into an episode.
What I loved about him too, the quality of that stuff. I feel he's underrated as a cartoonist, and certainly as a gag writer, and a designer as well. And the attention that I believe he still pays to each and every strip, right? He's intimately. Am I right about that?
He was not shy about telling people he had his assistants when they did little documentaries about him. He would put his assistants on camera drawing what they drew.
Yeah.
But he was the guy who wrote the gags or approved the gags and spent time sketching them out roughly. And assistants were a big secret.
That's a grand tradition, though, of comic strips,
Al
right?
Cap never put his assistants on camera. Walt Kelly, whom I dearly love, and now I am part of the Walt Kelly empire. He had an assistant who most people never heard of, who did a lot of work. Most newspaper strips had serious assisting on them.
I mean, Frank Frazetta did Little Abner, right?
Frank Frazetta was one of about 5 guys who worked on Little Abner over the years, yeah, along with Bob Lubers and Andy Amato, and I can't remember all the other guys' names. But that's the problem. You don't remember a lot of these guys' names.
Yeah, right.
People used to. I am very limited in my defense of Bob Kane, another guy who I think deserves a lot of scorn, but he sometimes gets more than he deserves.
Yes.
People will say Bob Kane never put Bill Finger's name on Batman, and that's shameful. Okay, you want to tell me who wrote Flash Gordon for Alex Raymond?
Yeah, fair enough.
There
there was this grand tradition of studios and stuff and uncredited assistants coming from the strip world.
Floyd Gottfredson drew the Mickey Mouse newspaper strip for 30, 40 years, never got his name on it. And Floyd, I knew Floyd a little bit. He was a lovely man, great cartoonist, loved Walt Disney, thought it was, he got a living off it. He lived very well. And again, these Depression era guys, that mattered sometimes more to them than fame.
And ultimately, he got the credit too. Ultimately, he got credit for that work.
People, you and I know who he is, and the people watching this will know who Floyd Gottfredson was. There's
some of them do.
There's some really ugly stories about that stuff, but there's also cases where you go, I mean, I wrote jokes for guys who were on the Tonight Show, and the guy didn't stop in his joke in his middle of his monologue and say, "Oh, by the way, those last 3 jokes were by Mark Evanier." That's just
right, of course.
That's part of it. There are people who don't get credit in movies. 8 guys write a movie and 2 guys get credit.
So he loved Jim Davis. Was fanatical about the quality. Has control over every product.
So he said, "I can't write a Saturday morning series. I just don't have the time." Jim is one of these guys who, if you wanted to make an appointment with him, you called his assistant and said, "I need to talk to Jim." And she'd look at his calendar and say, "Okay, he can talk to you on Tuesday between 2:14 and 2:37, or something like that," because he worked so hard. He would get up in the morning at 5 a.m. Muncie time. I'd be going to bed. He would actually email me, and I would have a conference with him at 3 a.m. my time, because he was up, and he would say to me, "Oh, Mark, on this script, I think you should do this," or whatever. And then at some point, he just turned it over to me. He just let me alone.
Yeah.
But to put in the part of this story I haven't gotten in yet, Judy Price at CBS said to him, "If I can find a writer you trust, will you let us do a Garfield Saturday morning show?" And he said, "Yeah, but I doubt that you can do it." So Judy had me write a Garfield script for the money I was due for the Michael Jackson project. And I said to her, not knowing this backstory, I said, "Oh, you want to do Garfield show? Well, listen, you want me to go meet with Jim Davis and talk?" She said, "No, just write me a script. Just write me a Garfield script for what you would do with the Saturday morning show." So,
and had you watched the specials?
I had watched the specials. I also had some, but not all, of the paperbacks of Garfield. And I walked to CBS for that meeting. So on the way home, I went through a bookstore and picked up the other paperbacks. And I came back to this desk where I'm sitting, and I wrote a Garfield script with no input from Jim or the network, really. And I wrote this thing, and I sent it over to CBS. And Judy called me up, and she said, "You happy with this script?" And I said, "Yeah, I think it's pretty good." She said, "Good, I'm going to send it to Jim." And then she told me that Jim was skeptical it could be written.
Yes.
I didn't know that when I wrote it. And so she said, "I'm sending it over to him." I think she said she wasn't even going to read it herself, so she trusted me enough. So she sends it off, and I'm sitting here thinking, well, Jim Davis is going to have me shot or something like that. He's going to be really, And I get a call 2 days later, 3 days later. Some woman says, "Is this Mark Evanier?" I said, "Yes, it is." She said, "Please hold for Jim Davis." And I'm sitting here going, is this guy going to scream at me? And he said, "Well, I guess somebody else can write Garfield the way I want."
Awesome.
And he said, "What do we have to do to make this show the biggest hit on Saturday morning?" And I said, "Get a 2-year commitment, get them to leave us alone from editorially, and and I quoted a price that I thought the license fee should be that would be very high for it." And he said, "Okay, I'll call you back." 2 days later, he called me back, and he said, "Okay, you got the Never's Going to Leave You Alone. We got a 2-year commitment. They gave us the money you asked for. Don't screw it up." And we then were on the air for 8 years, 7 years, whatever it was. We were the number one show on CBS for like 8 years.
Were you voice directing from the beginning?
Jim came out and voice directed the first few. He loved doing it. Jim had, at that time, he had a private jet. The man had a private jet. And he'd come out, and we'd record over 2 days. And on the day in between, he'd take his private jet to Vegas and gamble. And he would come back, and we'd say, "How'd you do in Vegas?" He'd say, "Oh, God, I lost $400. I said, "Jim, how much is the gasoline? How much did you spend on?" I said, "Jim, wait a minute. I can lose $400.
How much did you tip the sky cap, Jim, on your way in?"
The gasoline to Vegas and back is like $1,200, but he lost $400 at the casinos. but he did this for a while, and then one day and then at the meet, what happened was he'd be we'd be voice direct. I cast the new actors because he didn't know the talent pool, and I knew all the voice actors, and I had done voice directing before on a limited basis. So I would cast the other actors, and I would say to Jim, "This guy, I want this guy to do this voice," and he'd say, "Fine," and he'd direct them. And then what would happen would be in the middle of the session, he'd get a business call, and he'd say, "Mark, you direct the next two scenes. I got to go take this call. Mark, you direct the next scene of that." And pretty soon he just said, "Mark, I'm not going to come out. You just direct the shows." So I
Was
directed.
Lorenzo Music the voice of Garfield from the first specials?
The very first Garfield was animated was for a special called The Fantastic Funnies, produced by Lee Mendelson, who also produced the Garfield show. They animated about 3 minutes of Garfield, and the voice was done by a man named Scott Beach, who was a San Francisco radio personality. If people listen to the Dr. Demento shows in its prime, Scott Beach had a record called Religion and Politics that was very often played on that show, and he had other novelty records he did. And when they got into the animated series, the primetime specials, Jim thought it was the wrong voice, and they auditioned every damn person in town who did voices and picked Lorenzo. So he did it. Throughout.
Was there a second choice? Like, who could have been a better pick? I can't imagine in my head when that voice came on. I was like, oh my gosh.
Well, there were people who were fans of Garfield who said, "That's not the way I heard Garfield." They had their own voice in his head, and I said, "Well, take it up with the creator of the character. He picked them." I didn't have a say in the matter. I knew Lorenzo before that. I'd worked with Lorenzo on a pilot for Carlton, Your Doorman as an animated series.
I was going to say, it's so great that he's known for his voice, too. Like, his voice is recognizable. You'd go, oh, that's Carlton the Doorman if you knew that.
Literally, what happened was they were doing this primetime pilot special of Carlton, and I was recommended to Lorenzo by someone who knew me and said, "This guy is one of the few guys at the moment who can write animation and live action." So I'm in my apartment. This is absolutely true. Phone rings. I pick it up. I go, "Hello," and a voice on the other end says, "Hi, I'm looking for Mark Evanier." And I said, "Oh, hi, Lorenzo." I recognized his voice.
Of course. How could you not, right? Yeah.
And there was a pause, and he said, "You made me so fast." And we became friends then. And I took Lorenzo. He was at that time toying with the idea of a sitcom set in a cartoon studio. He was working for the MTM people, and later that idea he dropped it, and somebody else picked up with it and became a show called The Duck Factory.
Duck Factory, right?
But before that, I took him on a tour of Hanna-Barbera. I took Lorenzo over to Hanna-Barbera and showed him what a big studio looked like. The Duck Factory show, the show he would have done would have been about a small studio. But I showed him, and I introduced him to Gordon Hunt, who was the voice director at Hanna-Barbera at the time. And they were casting the Pac-Man show, the second season of Pac-Man. They were trying to find a voice for a character named Super Pac, or maybe it was the first season. Whatever it was, they asked Lorenzo right on that spot to audition for Super Pac, and he got it. And that was his first cartoon voice job that wasn't for MTM. Yeah, but then...
And Duck Factory, just to real quick, that was like, wasn't that Jim Carrey or Michael Richards?
Jim Carrey, Teresa Ganzel, Julie Payne, who was also a voice on Garfield, Don Messick, Jack Gilford,
amazing.
Yeah.
And I don't know, has anyone ever talked to you about the synchronicity about Garfield and Bill Murray? I'm sure you must have had somebody bring that up to you or thought about it.
Yes.
The fact that, and I'll just really quickly, that Lorenzo Music was Garfield, and then he played Bill Murray's character in the real Ghostbusters cartoon.
Yeah.
And then the Garfield movie came out, and Bill Murray played Garfield.
Lorenzo was Lorenzo. He had the one voice. It was a wonderful voice. We sometimes played around by having him do another voice here and there, just for the sake of. And he could occasionally come up with do evil Garfield or angelic Garfield or Garfield's uncle, and he did a Buddy Bear. Lorenzo was one of the Buddy Bears. when we did those characters. Those were all sped up voices. But he had the great voice, and people, exploited it where they could exploit it, and he exploited it where he could exploit it. Lovely man. He was one of the reasons that show was a joy. The whole
Oh
cast was
yeah.
wonderful on that show, and
A
uh,
murderer's row of voice actors
well,
on that
I
show.
got to hire anybody I wanted. That's where I got to bring in Buddy Hackett and Jonathan Winters and Don Knotts and Stan Freberg and other people. And then I
Did
used some
Maurice
people.
LaMarche work on
Maurice
that?
LaMarche was on the later Garfield show, but not on the first one. Um, but I got to hire people I'd always wanted to work with. Um, and character actors. I love old character actors. We brought in some people who hadn't done voices in a long time. There was a woman named Julie Bennett who was the voice of Cindy Bear. We had her come in and do a few episodes of Garfield. She hadn't done a cartoon in a few years at that point. We had June Foray on the show a lot. We had
Oh yeah.
Larry Storch was on the show. We
Oh.
had we had a we had a I was at a party at my lawyer's house. My lawyer also represented George Foreman, and George Foreman said, "I want to be in a cartoon show." So I did a story about a prize fighter who couldn't stop eating, and George Foreman came in and did the voice.
Nice.
We had an episode with George Hearn, one of my favorite Broadway stars. We wrote a musical for him that he sang. We had just interesting people all the time. We had Chick Hearn, the voice of the L.A. Lakers. We did an episode about basketball, and Chick Hearn came in and played Chick Hearn. And we had Paul Winchell on the show, and the core cast was Lorenzo. We had this versatile, brilliant actor named Greg Berger who played Odie and a lot of the supporting characters, and
Ah
a gentleman named
yes.
Tom Hughey who had worked for Jim, who was an old friend of Jim's who worked for him. He was the voice of John. We had Julie Payne playing John's girlfriend. We had this segment called U.S. Acres in the show where Greg Berger and Tom Hughey did voices, but also Howie Morris, who I became very close friends with. And Frank Welker was on the show a lot, who's a friend of
Oh yeah.
mine and is kind of amazing at everything. And Frank took over as Garfield after Lorenzo died.
Oh, I did
Uh,
not know
yeah,
that.
yeah, he's been the voice
He
of
is
Garfield.
that guy is amazing. That's
Yeah, he is.
amazing.
I used to come home from dates and I'd be playing back my voicemail, and my date could hear the voicemail, and there'd be a message from Sean Connery saying he was sorry he missed me. And then the next message would be from Gregory Peck. And the next message would be, and then and would be from Bob Hope, and they're all Frank. Just
Yeah.
and
Okay. I don't even have time, Mark. I hope you will come back here someday and we can talk
Okay,
about Scrappy Doo and so many other things.
yeah. I just working for Hanna Barbera. There's another one of those. I watched their cartoons as a kid, and one day I'm sitting across the table from Joe Barbera, who was an amazing man, a fascinating, colorful, brilliant. Boy, am I glad I met him in person.
Did you get to work with Dawes Butler?
Oh, a lot with Dawes Butler. Yeah,
Oh my gosh.
Dawes was on. I wrote the Primetime Yogi Bear special, but I knew Dawes real well. I used to go to Dawes' workshop. He had this great thing for students that produced some of the best next generation voice people of all. I used to have Dawes on my answering machine. As I had one of Dawes is Huckleberry Hound and one of Dawes is Yogi Bear, and people would listen and they go, Evanier, that's the lousiest impression I've ever heard. You can't sound, you don't sound like Yogi Bear. But he was uh, just a
as much
lovely man. And I got to
as much
direct
credit as
I got to direct Mel Blanc once.
well, I was just about to say, as much credit as Mel Blanc gets and deserves, Dawes Butler is kind of like the shadow Mel Blanc, the guy that I feel like never got his due, like Mel
Dawes
deserved.
was one of the nicest, most wonderful people I ever met in my life. And you will not find another voice actor or anybody who knew him who will tell you any different. He was truly
Awesome.
beloved. Thank you, Gabriel. Um, but this is very fortunate. I kind of like doing these interviews where I talk about other people instead of myself because I've met so many people who are way more fascinating than I am. And
Mark, your
I'd like
false
to share
humility does not work here, my friend. It's not
Oh,
working because we
okay.
know how talented you are.
All right, I'm not good at false humility. I say, all right, fine.
Oh,
I
you're
used to
good at
tell
that, though.
people I'm not good at self-deprecating remarks. I just can't do self-deprecating remarks.
Terrible at them.
Yeah. But you know, Dan, you got a nice little show here, and I'm glad I could fill.
Oh,
what are
thank
we?
you.
Are we on hour 2.5 now here?
We're 2.5 hours went by like nothing. I appreciate it. I have to get back to work. I know you got to get back to work.
I've got to get back to work. Yes.
But thank you so much, Mark.
Okay.
Incredible. I just want to say I've been a fan of your blog for 20 years maybe now. As amazing as that sounds, or close to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really good at things that don't pay any money.
Well, check out newsfromemmy.com, people. Check it out. And Mark Evanier, thank you. I have to do my outro and stuff. If you have time to stick around,
I'll listen.
But if you
I'll
don't,
listen. Go.
Okay.
Take me off the screen, and let me listen to the outro.
Shall do so. Thank you again, Mark. Oh, and thank you, folks. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Was that one of the coolest interviews I've ever had here? I think so. Man, to be able to talk about so many of these things that I've wanted to talk to this guy about for decades. Amazing. And it's not just 2 decades or so of blog loving. It's like many decades of comic loving, and just guys written so many articles about comics and books about comics and everything. It's kind of the nexus of many things in the comic book universe for me. And I'll tell you the one thing. I know a guy, Mark knows him too. His name is Joe Ferrara. Joe Ferrara owns a comic book store called Atlantis Fantasy World. And Joe's not the highest tech guy. He's not always up to computer, but he would always tell me one thing. He reads Mark Evanier's blog, and that's all he really needs. He gets all his news off of that. I suggest you check it out because it's really just fun reading. It's one of the few blogs. There used to be many blogs. I've read many blogs. There's only one that I still read to this day, and that I just like go to and read every day because it's fun to read. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for liking and subscribing to this thing. I'm really hoping, Mark, maybe we'll do a blog post and share this with people, because, man, I really appreciate it. He's got a humongous audience of the kind of people that might like the kind of thing that we lay down here at Comic Book News. So if you like it, click that like button, click subscribe, click that thumbs up if you liked it. If you didn't, click the thumbs down, but maybe leave a comment. Talk about how we could improve things. Give me some constructive criticism. I've got more guests planned, and I've got, of course, we've got the credits coming up in a second. And of course, a secret comic book cameo at the end of the credits, like any good comic book property. We've got that. This one was even mentioned by our guest a little earlier, so stay tuned and stick around for that. Next week, I got somebody. I'm not going to announce it. This Sunday, though, I've got the Image Grand Design team. This was maybe the biggest, greatest modern fanzine APA-like effort that I can think of. Cool book put together by fans of Image Comics to show just their love to the creators and the comics. We're going to bring those people in and just talk all about it. When will that be? It's going to be in the temporal period officially designated as next time.
Oh, we are the Buddy Bears, we always get along. Each day we do a little dance and sing a little song. If you ever disagree, it means that you are wrong. Oh, we are the Buddy Bears, we always get along.
Don't do an encore.
Oh, we are the Buddy Bears, we're here to clean your place. We'll work and always have a smile on each and every face. If we don't clean fast enough, we'll hurry up our pace. Oh, we are the Buddy Bears, we're here to clean your place. Oh, we are the Buddy Bears, we're never ever rude. We'll sing and dance and laugh for you if you are in the mood.
If you want to make us leave, then give us lots of food.
Oh, we are the Buddy Bears, we're never ever rude.